Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Traitor's face in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, Old Friends. Zhao's career had gone down a hole. Literally. He looked out through the window of his temporary office at the interior of the world's largest sinkhole, and the Fire Nation outpost Tiankang fortress that had been constructed within it. The office itself was in one of the many towers extending up from the fortress proper at the base of the sinkhole, an architectural strategy necessitated by the enclosed location. Tonight, Zhao could see little activity aside from the regular patrols, but nevertheless the torches and lanterns throughout the space were all lit, filling the underground with crimson-tinted light. The complex network of ramps and scaffolding were shaded like bloody bones, making the sinkhole into their crude grave. It was far from the best view in the colonial continent, but Zhao was not here for sightseeing. There was a knock on the office door, and Zhao looked up from his desk and barked, "Come." An aide appeared in the doorway with a stack of papers. "Those are the latest communications." The aide nodded, and deposited them on the desk. Zhao started going through them, but didn't see the routing codes he had been hoping for on any of them. "Nothing about our special guest, then." "Dismissed." The aide bowed and retreated, and Zhao got on with reading the latest news. He was disappointed at not getting the orders he was hoping for, but he would not let that hold him back. Other than the one complication presented by that guest, his mission was proceeding well. He had been surprised, all those weeks ago, at the specific orders waiting for him when he landed on the colonial continent after his escape from the Fire Nation, but they had all been well within his abilities. He had learned about desert survival during an observational assignment to the Si Wang Desert years ago, and so he had been able to lead an assault force into the local ashland with little trouble. His soldiers had assaulted the abbey they found exactly where they supposed to with skill and precision, capturing the denizens without losses. That most of the residents of the abbey were actually airbenders, further proof of Zhao's theory that resistance to Fire Nation rule was more secret and dangerous than anyone suspected was even better. Now, the prisoners were all secured here in Tiankang Fortress, ready for the next phase of the plan as soon as Zhao received reliable intelligence on the Avatar's location. If the orders Zhao had requested didn't arrive before then, he could always leave his complicated guest behind in the care of the Tiankang's regular commander and let Prince Iroh worry about the resulting political complications. After all, that was what royalty was supposed to do. With that in mind, Zhao began the dreary task of reading the latest reports about the Avatar's possible movements. It was now believed that one of the Avatar's suspected companions, a young water tribe man who had disappeared from the South Pole during the uprising there, was present at an incident between Fire Nation authorities and local citizens taking place during a major cultural festival. It was centered on some scandal involving a colonial bureaucrat which didn't interest Zhao at all, but if the Avatar really had been at the festival, then according to the maps, that would have placed him somewhere in the... A gong rang out through the main body of the sinkhole, and kept ringing in a pattern that meant there were intruders somewhere on the fortress grounds. Could someone have really gotten through all the outer defenses and into the sinkhole itself? Had some Earthbenders rebels gotten delusions of grandeur? Zhao got up and ran for the window, searching the red gloom for signs of activity. He spotted several squads of soldiers running along the ramp system, converging on a reinforced loading platform at about the sinkhole's halfway point. There seemed to be some activity on the platform, a fight between guards and someone in green, someone who seemed to move well and fought with a sword and throwing blades. And Zhao's jaw dropped. Lady Caldera Yumai herself was in the fortress. The Avatar might be with her, somewhere. Zhao's surprise turned into a grin. All his enemies were trapped here with him. He hurried out of his office and said to the first aide he could find, "Put the base on full lockdown. Seal off the entrance to the sinkhole completely. Nothing is to get out." Then, without waiting for an acknowledgement, he ran off to take command of the defense. The glory of this capture would be his. Sokka couldn't make himself move. He sat there, completely soaked from the secret water-bent tunnel, unable to even shiver. His whole reality was transfixed by the sight of all the piled stone against the sinkhole wall, formerly the hole he had jumped through with Mai, and now was. His little sister had been in there. Aang had been in there. They had still been in there when it came down. Sokka knew about cave-ins. They were a danger in the South Pole mines, and they were always fatal for anyone caught in them. No one could survive having a mountain dropped on them, not without earthbending, and Aang said he didn't know how to do it. There hadn't been time for him to start that crazy glowing thing and call on Kyoshi or whoever the kid relied on for all his rock-moving needs. So Aang had to be dead. Katara had to be dead. They were dead. Sokka had gotten them killed. He hadn't seen the danger, and so they had died. He could only stare at their final resting place while chaos happened around him. Mai had extricated herself from the pile of boxes they had crashed into together and gone see about something she must have found interesting. There was a sound like an alarm going on in the background, and noise that could have been a fight nearby, but it was all muted in Sokka's ears. The world around him was nothing compared to the sick feeling spreading throughout his whole chest at the thought that he had freed his sister from a cage just to get her crushed to death in a grave of rock and water. The red light of the sinkhole's lanterns even colored the stone like blood. That was appropriate, Sokka supposed. Gross, but appropriate. He couldn't stop himself from picturing his little sister's flattened body. Then cold hands grabbed his shirt and yanked him up so that his vision was filled with Mai's face. Like him, she was soaked, and drops of water streamed down from her hair across her blank expression. They almost looked like tears, but Sokka knew Mai would never cry for anyone not from the Fire Nation. "Get up," she hissed. "More soldiers are coming." Sokka hated Mai. She really wanted to do a whole fighting and running routine now, with Katara and Aang dead? Why bother fighting at all? She probably just liked fighting. This was a big game for her. She shook him hard enough to rattle the thoughts in his head. "Get up. I'm not going to let you die here. Why bother?" Sokka tried to push her away, but his arms were weak, and they collapsed against her tensed muscles. "Because I can't think of anything else to do right now." She let go of him, and Sokka dropped back to the metal floor. Mai wiped at her face and flicked the water onto the ground. "Aang has powers I don't understand, so he might be alive and might have saved Katara. And I'm pretty sure that without you, I'm going to die. But you don't care, do you?" Her eyes flicked to the side, and she turned around and drew knives. Sokka noticed that her clothes were torn in places and even sported singing at the end of one sleeve. How much fighting had she already done? Sokka moved his gaze back to the collapsed cave. His little sister was dead in there. But she had come here because she wanted to fix the world. Fix it for Gran, and the tribe, and even people she didn't know. Aang wanted to fix it for everyone, even the Fire Nation. They were weird that way. The only reason Sokka had ever risked anything was to save the people he already liked. He knew he couldn't save the world, and wasn't inclined to try, especially not now. But he could help Mai, supposedly, according to her very biased opinion. Katara and Aang liked Mai for some reason. They'd hate it if he let her die. Especially if she was right, and they might still be alive. Could they be alive? Mai had seen all the same freaky avatar stuff he had, and more besides. She had been in that volcano with him when it exploded. Was she just being optimistic, or did she really know something that Sokka didn't? Wait, what was he saying? Mai being optimistic? So it was just a matter of deciding if he trusted her judgment. Did he have enough respect for that stuck-up, selfish, crazy, manipulator of a woman? Sokka breathed in, and breathed out again. Yes, he did respect her. Just barely, but it was enough. Fine, then. Time to go to work. Sokka pushed all thoughts of the cave-in behind that wall in his mind, where he kept all those things that were far too heavy to think about. If he let them out, they would weigh him down until he couldn't move, couldn't find a reason to move, couldn't do anything. Behind the wall were the deaths of his parents, the separation from his tribe, and all the ways he had helped the Fire Nation back before he found his courage thanks to Aang and Mai. With the cave-in solidly behind the wall, Sokka stood up, and turned to fight. He barely had time to straighten before he saw the edge of the saber blade coming down towards his head. He twisted out of the way with a battle cry of, "Aiaiaiaiku watch where you are swinging that," and shoved at the soldier who was trying to kill him. The guy stumbled back and bounced against a rope railing, and a second shove sent the guy over the railing to fall screaming into a massive abyss. With that sorted, Sokka decided that it was time to check out his surroundings. Everything was covered in that ugly red light, but the situation was pretty clear. An alarm gong was indeed being hammered with frantic energy, and Sokka seemed to be stuck on a platform halfway down the sinkhole that was, judging from the number of soldiers approaching on ramps and bridges and ladders, a pretty popular place. Mai was moving back and forth between the connecting ramps, using her sword and knives and even some well-placed kicks to keep the soldiers from flooding in. And she was losing. Some attackers got past her while she fought their compatriots, and came in at her with chops of sabers and thrusts of spears, and Sokka screamed as he ran at one and tackled the guy to the ground. The soldier had armor and a spear, but neither of those was exactly the best stuff to bring to a brawl, so Sokka twisted and shoved and wrestled and yanked and suddenly found himself stumbling backwards with a spear in his hand. His opponent got up and took a step forward, and Sokka panicked and shoved the spear straight into the soldier's gut, but then he realized he was holding the weapon backwards and so had done nothing but poked his opponent hard with a stick. Turning it around again would take too much time, so he thrust it again, this time right into the soldier's nose with shattering strength, and when the guy went down, Sokka took a moment to check out the situation again. It seemed that several other soldiers had started paying him a whole lot of attention. But that meant they weren't focusing on Mai, and she was one of those Weapon of the Fire Nation things. Sokka expected her to clear the area of enemies any second now, filling the air with flying knives and sprays of blood. He would enjoy seeing it. Instead, Mai ran to him, grabbed his arm, and yanked him along to the far end of the platform. Sokka blinked as he stumbled. "Why are we running?" "We're retreating," Mai grunted as she came to the platform's edge. A slash of her sword cut through the rope railing, and then she pointed it into the air. "Not running." Sokka followed the line of her sword to a large cargo hook dangling out in the open air just beyond the platform. "Oh." He glanced over and found her looking just as unenthusiastic as he felt about it. "Who goes first?" In response, she spun around and threw herself into battle with the soldiers who had been about to kill them. Well, okay, that was a pretty clear answer. Sokka discarded his stolen spear over the edge of the platform and backed up as much as he could without intruding on Mai's rear guarding. Then he took a running leap off the platform, screaming, as he flew through the air. He slammed into the crook of the hook and grabbed on with all the strength in his as the momentum of his jump transformed into a violent swinging. He barely had enough time to start to feel sick when the hook jolted again and the swinging got even more violent. He looked up to find Mai clutching the rope above him. A fireball flew past Sokka's head. So, what next? Mai wrapped her arms around the rope and kicked out with both of her legs into the air in front of her. The move generated enough force to set the rope swinging even further, and when it reached the highest point, she twisted to the side and kicked again. They swung back again, but now did so in an arc that took them away from the platform full of soldiers, an unpleasantly fast arc. Sokka swallowed heavily and held the hook like his life depended on it, which of course it did because he and Mai were terrible at the whole planning thing. Amidst the wind of their travel and the constant sounding of the alarm gongs, she called out, "Find us a spot to land." "Me. You have a better view." "Ugh." Sokka made himself look down and focus through the twisting motion. He had to find something below them, but not so far below that they would die on impact. Nor could he find something past where their momentum could carry them. And, ideally, there wouldn't be a whole mess of soldiers waiting for them. That didn't leave a whole lot of options, but there. "Drop in 3, 2, 1 now." He and Mai let go of the rope at the same time, and Sokka felt like he was falling for an eternity before he crashed down on the open-air elevator platform he had picked out, although he knew it couldn't have even been a whole second. Mai landed on top of him, and the combined force of their impact set the elevator wobbling like stormy seas. They slid towards the closest edge together, but were stopped by the rope railing. Good thing the Fire Nation valued safety so much. Sokka pushed Mai off his back, dumping her on the platform beside him. "You're heavier than usual. I wear a sword now. And I'm soaking wet." She clutched the rope railing and swallowed heavily. That's right, she got seasick, didn't she? Well, that would be the perfect addition to this whole experience. We need to find a way off this thing. Sure, fine. Sokka stood up and glanced around, trying to find some way to control the elevator but not seeing anything. He hoped they weren't stuck here. He looked up to see where they was hanging from, but he was immediately distracted by the spears and arrows and fireballs all dropping down towards them. He eyeballed a few kinematic calculations related to projectile motion of the incoming objects and realized that the elevator platform was at the center of far too many vectors, and there was nothing that could be done about it. So he took the only option open to him. He jumped on top of Mai, threw his arms around her so that they wouldn't get separated, and pressed them both down to the floor into the smallest shape they could manage. With his vision filled by Mai's hair, Sokka could only listen as those spears and arrows and fireballs struck the elevator platform around them. He felt the warmth of flames passing over and around him even through his soaked shirt, and while some of it abated quickly, there was a lingering heat that had to be bad news. Sokka looked up and found that spears and arrows lodged into the wooden platform were burning and threatening to spread their flame, but more importantly, the large ropes keeping the whole elevator suspended were also on fire. Slush. He had nothing to put the fires out with, nothing to replace the ropes with, no way to fly, no way to magically summon Appa from outside the sinkhole, and was fresh out of favors owed to him by gravity-controlling spirits. He was still trying to figure out what to do when the ropes broke and the whole elevator dropped out beneath him. He didn't even have time to start a good scream. He could only hold on to Mai in a death grip and she was returning the favor as they fell. The drop lasted long enough to almost feel like flying, but then he crashed into something hard enough to make his body blaze with pain, but somehow he was still falling and there was another crash and Mai cried out as she took the brunt of that one and more falling. Then Sokka hit something hard and color exploded in front of his closed eyes and breathing was suddenly impossible and he was rolling across something hard too fast to stop and then more open air and one last hard impact that brought him to a halt so jarring that the world just plain went away for a moment. Reality came back and he gasped for air, but his chest was burning and half of what he was trying to breathe turned out to be Mai's hair. Was she even alive? There was a loud, ominous creaking of wood. Then whatever they were laying on collapsed for another short fall and this time when the world went away, it stayed gone for a good long time. Zhao looked down through the sinkhole and tried to calculate the odds that Mai and her water tribe companion were dead. He thought it likely, but they hadn't suffered a straight drop, so there was a chance of life. And even with her body bruised and broken, Mai would probably not just lie down and wait for him to come for her. Well, that was fine. She might be a weapon of the Fire Nation, but she was only mortal. She was injured to some degree, trapped in the sinkhole, and all alone with just one ally who might even be dead. Zhao had an army, and the battleground was under his complete control. He looked up at the soldiers standing around him on the large ramp. Well? Get down there and find them. I'll have 2 corpses or 2 more prisoners by dawn, and I don't particularly care which. The troops moved out, but Zhao took a moment to linger. He was in command, after all, and had to take in all the relevant considerations. Mai was here with her pet tribal, but so far there was no sign of the Avatar. There were signs of a cave-in near the platform where she had first appeared, but what did that signify? Surely the Avatar, the one who had commanded the Everstorm and powered a whole volcano, wouldn't allow a tunnel to collapse on him. And Mai was wearing green, now, matching the reports from the rough rhinos. Perhaps he and Mai had connected with more conventional earthbender rebels? Signs of enemy activity occasionally popped up in this area, but nothing that local command saw as organized resistance. And then there was the matter of the airbender prisoners. How had Iroh known that they were living in the middle of an ashland? Word must have come from an informant of some kind. Zhao had been given strict orders to take all the airbenders alive, when they obviously posed a threat to the Fire Nation's domination. And Iroh had specified that the airbenders should be taken to this very fortress. Tian Keng was an ideal place to hold people who could fly, but perhaps Iroh had more than one consideration in mind. And then there was the special guest that had prompted Zhao to request further orders with no response. Was it just an ordinary delay or deliberate silence? Zhao remembered the theory he had presented to High Command back in the Fire Nation, which might even be true, that Prince Ozai had been in cahoots with an organized rebel organization allied with the Avatar. Zhao had implied that it was Ozai's way of trying to seize the throne. But what if he had implicated the wrong prince? Iroh had always been the more superstitious of the two. Iroh was the crown prince and had no need of conspiracies to make himself Fire Lord, but if there were other things the Avatar might offer Iroh. Well, Iroh was Zhao's patron now, and of course loyal service was the best way to get ahead at the moment. But Zhao would keep all the possibilities in mind. He looked to his subordinates standing beside him, and motioned to the platform where Mai and her companion had first appeared. Post some guards over there, and wake up one of the geology specialists on staff here. I want to know what's under all that rubble, and how infiltrators got into the sinkhole. In the meantime, I will lead the search for these intruders, and see what they have to say for themselves before they die. Yarg, Mai groaned as she opened her eyes. Wherever she and Sokka had landed, it was dark and there were walls around them, and they seemed to be alone. And they were alive. So far, so good. Then a blade of doubt stabbed into her heart. Was Sokka alive? That had been a pretty bad series of falls, and he had taken at least as much of a battering as she had. They were still twisted up together, so she untangled her limbs with the same care she used when sharpening her most dangerous blades, and slid away from his body one bit at a time. When she was free, she sat up and took a quick look around. Very dark, small room, furniture of some kind, and lots of wood debris. She glanced up and saw that the wooden ceiling, a nice, reinforced ceiling, had a jagged hole in it, and the tenderness of her body was the only clue Mai needed to identify the hole as their own improvised entrance. She leaned over Sokka and pressed one hand to the pulse in his neck while she held the other under his nose. The good news was that he was alive and breathing. The bad news was that he wasn't reacting to her touch. Could he have hit his head at some point? She couldn't see any obvious injuries in the dark, and the last thing she wanted was to start prodding without any idea what she was doing. If Katara was still alive, she would hate Mai for getting Sokka killed. Hey, bonehead. We need to get out of here. Mai waited, but there was no response. There could be soldiers on their way right now. We have to get back on the move. Still nothing. If this all goes wrong, it's going to be your fault. Was that a twitch on his face? Sokka. His eyes flew open, and then immediately shut again as he winced. Oh, I am in so much pain right now. Hurts to breathe. Mai heaved a sigh and sat back. I hate you so much. You had me worried. Well, Sokka groaned, you worry me, ow, all the time, so fair's fair. He started to move, but then his eyes went wide again and he twisted like had fallen into a campfire. He finally stopped in a prone position, panting. Ow, I think that's a rib. He poked at his left side, and immediately repeated, triple Yeah, that's a rib. Slush, that's going to, ow, be a problem. I can, barely move. Mai resisted her own impulse to curse. Well, we have to move. So suck it up and deal with the pain. Did I, mention that it hurts to breath? Mai sighed. She patted herself for a knife. It seemed that she had lost some of her arsenal during the falls, and when she found one, she started slicing away at her robe. It hung long over her pants, so there was plenty of extra fabric to spare, and her clothes had dried enough that it was an easy cut. First she sliced just below her waist to turn the robe into a long-sleeved shirt, and then took all the extra fabric and cut it into long strips. Sit up. I don't care how much it hurts. Sokka groaned but did as she said, and Mai proceeded to tie the strips over his chest as supportive bandages. She tried to be as gentle as possible, and he only whined like a baby a little before she was done. She sat back and looked at him. Well. Sokka took a moment to steady his breathing again, and then eased himself up until he was standing with the care of an old man. That helps. Thanks. I'm still not going to be any good in a fight, but I can move. Any really sharp pain? No, I think it's just a plain fracture. I can breathe now. Well, that was some relief. Sokka had been a help up there in the first fight, but even Mai couldn't fight a whole army on hostile landscape. If it came down to another battle, it didn't really matter whether Sokka could join in. On the other hand, he probably wasn't in any condition for running, either, and that was something he was much more likely to need to do in the near future. It was starting to look like it didn't matter whether Aang and Katara had survived the cave-in. Mai and Sokka weren't going to live to see them again either way. But the prospect of dying did keep things interesting, didn't it? She got to her feet and took a better look around their sanctuary. We'll have to stay out of sight, and see if we can find where the airbenders might be. If we can get them free before we're noticed, we'll have a is it just me, or is this room pretty nice? Some of the sinkhole's lantern light was shining in through the hole in the ceiling, and now that Maya was really looking, she realized that she was in what seemed like someone's apartment. There was a lounging chair, a small desk, a table with some books on it, a little shrine, and even a decorative wall scroll. Maya spotted two doors, one of which was much thicker than the other. She checked that one out first, and found it to be a metal thing with a good lock that wouldn't open from this side. The walls, too, were metal, and there was no chance the door was coming off without specialized tools. Maya had the sinking feeling that she and Sokka had fallen into some kind of weird posh prison, but there was one more door to check. And maybe someone living in this jail apartment. Drawing her sword, Maya waved Sokka to stay where he was as she approached the small door. This one was wood, and slid open without resistance. The next room was a bedroom, and the bed had obviously been slept in very recently. Maya raised her sword into a defensive position and immediately sidestepped out of the doorway that combined with the light coming through it were making her a target. She had barely moved before she heard the sound of footsteps. The light, graceful movements of a true warrior and a thin silhouette rushed in at her. Maya twisted out of the way of a series of hand strikes and then sprang forward with a stab of her sword, but her attacker was already somewhere else. Maya instinctively backpedaled again and heard the distinct sound of fists rushing through the empty air in front of her, and then she ducked and heard the enemy blows missing her again, so she kicked out with a sweeping leg, but somehow her attacker was already jumping and Maya stabbed up with her sword and there was a little tug of resistance and a few hairs fell onto her face and she rolled forward to avoid what she knew would be the next attack and smiled because this was just like the old days. And old days? Maya threw herself back towards the doorway in a movement that was half a run and half a jump and grabbed the door to push herself into an even faster stumble that left her crashing to the floor of the room where Sokka was still waiting. He said, "What is it?" Maya's fall hurt far more than it should have, which she guessed meant she was covered in bruises from the earlier crash down the sinkhole, but she had accomplished her mission. She was back where the red light of Tian Kang's lamps filtered in through the hole in the ceiling, and Maya could see again. She could see her attacker follow her into the room. She could see that her attacker was a cute young lady, loose brown hair flying through the air and white shift straining against her athletic body as she leaped through the doorway. Maya was on her feet in an instant despite her pain, and her sword had tumbled from hands that no longer had the strength to hold any kind of weapon. Somehow, she was seeing a ghost. The familiar figure landed, fists, arrow fists, with one finger on each raised a bit so that the knuckle could make a precision strike, held high and all too familiar extended guard. Her eyes locked on Maya, and then the aggressive expression melted from her soft features as she blinked her big, vulnerable eyes. Maya had to concentrate to make herself breathe. Ty Lee. They stared at each other across the apartment. It couldn't be. Ty Lee was dead. Maya knew this. Ty Lee's circus had been caught in the conflagration started when some overexcited soldiers had turned the power of Sozin's comet on some stupid fortress no one cared about. The soldiers had investigated it, had found the remains of humans and rare animals, and enough identifiable equipment to confirm which circus it had been. No one could have survived. And yet here Ty Lee was, at the bottom of Tian Kang Fortress and trying to punch Maya's lights out. Maya stood there, blinking and confused. Then she laughed, threw herself forward, and met Ty Lee's hug with a crushing one of her own as she cried, "You're alive." "Yes. That's great. I know. I thought you had burned to death." "Sorry. You should be." Maya couldn't make herself let go of her friend. It was Ty Lee's voice, Ty Lee's stupid way of talking, Ty Lee's smell, Ty Lee's smooth skin, Ty Lee's strong muscles, Ty Lee's weird way of wrapping her arms around Maya's neck and pressing their faces together, even Ty Lee's odd habit of humming during any hug that lasted for more than 3 seconds. Maya pulled back out of the embrace, but only to gain enough distance to look at her friend again. She was afraid that if she let go, Ty Lee would somehow disappear again, as irrational as that sounded. Ty Lee wasn't a ghost or a hallucination, she was a real girl, the one Maya had known for a decade, that collection of habits and factoids and quirks so familiar that Mai could dream of her with more accuracy than anyone else. Mai blinked against the itchy feeling in her eyes. How are you alive? They told us you burned to death. I got lucky, and I had some help. It's a long story. But how did you find me? I didn't think anyone knew they were keeping me here. Mai opened her mouth to answer, but Sokka cut in with, sorry to say, but we're not here to rescue you. We kind of fell in here by accident. I take it you're an old friend of our Fire Nation reject here. Ty Lee startled in Mai side. Sokka had sat himself down on the lounging chair, and was looking at them with what seemed to Mai like a mix of amusement and annoyance. She was going to tell him to go find someplace uncomfortable to stick his head, but Ty Lee got up and reached for a lamp on the wall. A flick of a switch brought the same red glow that had lit the outside, and Ty Lee bounced over to bow formally at the waist to Sokka. Nice to meet you. You're with Mai. Sokka blinked, and Mai bet he found the sight of Ty Lee bowing in her shift to be more than a bit overwhelming. Nice to meet you, too. And yeah, I guess I'm with Mai, as much as we both hate it. Oh, you two aren't friends. Ty Lee rose again, and spun to face Mai again. Actually, you look pretty awful right now. Your aura was completely black before you realized who I was. And your clothes and hair. I didn't think anything would be able to get you out in public looking like that. Gee, thanks. But Mai had to suppress a smile. Hearing Ty Lee mention auras again was just the kind of stupidity she had been missing. I've had a pretty bad year. But the meathead is right, we didn't know you were here. Finding you is just some kind of crazy coincidence. She braced herself for Ty Lee's disappointment. Instead, Ty Lee ran forward and grabbed Mai in another hug. The universe brought you here to save me and you didn't even realize it. That's the most romantic thing that ever happened to me. Mai laughed. She was even more amused when Sokka stammered, "Are romantic? You too dash." In an instant, Ty Lee had cartwheeled over and landed sitting beside Sokka on the chair. She leaned against him and said, "Oh, things can be romantic without being romantic. Don't be jealous of Mai, cutie. I'm still unattached. So, what's your name?" Sokka's jaw had dropped, and he seemed to be having trouble coming up with a reaction. Ash, Mai had missed this. Watching Ty Lee wrap a guy around her finger was one of the Fire Nation's most entertaining spectator sports. Still, they were running out of time before someone found them. That's Sokka, a rebel from the Southern Water Tribe. We've both been working for the Avatar, who's back. I'm a traitor to the Fire Nation and Azula will kill me if she ever finds me. We live on the back of a giant sky bison who flies us around the world having heroic adventures. Ty Lee looked at Mai. She turned to look at Sokka. Then she looked back at Mai. I can't tell if you're joking. Yeah, it's hilarious. We were here with the Avatar to try to free some airbenders that are supposedly being held prisoner, but we had some trouble with our infiltration. A cave-in separated us from the Avatar and our resident waterbender, and Sokka and I wound up trapped in here. We just kind of landed in your apartment here, Mai pointed up at the hole in the ceiling, while trying to survive an attack by every soldier in the entire sinkhole. And now we need to find a way to get out of here alive, preferably with those airbenders. Any questions? Ty Lee raised a hand. If I help you, can I meet the Sky Bison? Yes. Ty Lee was on her feet in an instant. Great. Let me just throw on some clothes and we'll do a daring escape. She ran back into the bedroom and slid the door closed. Over the sound of clothes being thrown around, she called through the door, I know those airbenders you're looking for. They're the ones who saved me from the fires. They live in an abbey that's now in the middle of a big ash desert, right? Mai and Sokka exchanged glances before she answered, yes. You saw what happened to them. Sure. They used to be an order of nuns, and that abbey was right near the fires. When my circus and a whole bunch of other travelers got caught, they came in to get some of us out. They were amazing. But it was even more amazing after that, when they discovered that they had become airbenders. They were really surprised. They took care of the survivors, and we all worked together, but then one day the fire army showed up and arrested us all. I did my Azula impression and was all, I am Lady Caldera Yu Tai Li, and what is the meaning of this? But that Commander Zhao Gai didn't care, and just told the soldiers to make me comfortable while he dash. Wait, Zhao. Mai's side, the stretch of skin marred by a burn scar, tightened, and her hands went to it reflexively. Zhao's in command here. The door slid open, revealing Tai Li in what looked like a circus costume. It was bright pink and left most of her midriff bare, while a redundant dragon dancer's skirt hung over the pants. Both the sleeves and legs were comically wide, but they were cut short to just past the elbows and knees. Tai Li had also done her hair up in a braided ponytail. As if she had no idea how ridiculous she looked, Tai Li nodded solemnly in the doorway. Zhao said he'd keep me here until he got word about what to do with me. I've been afraid that he was sending a wire to Angela, but it's been a while, and she'd never take so long to come and punish me. Mai listened with only half an ear, fighting against the memories of that painful night on Kyoshi Island, when Aang and Sokka had taken care of her while they raced to find her a healer on the Earth Kingdom mainland, all because of a wound she received betraying them. So it was left to Sokka to ask, why would Princess Angela punish you? Mai shuddered, and made herself pay attention to the here and now. Angela doesn't need an excuse for anything. We should definitely get moving. Is there a way out of here? Tai Li looked up at the ceiling. Well, it looks like you made a pretty big hole. Sokka cleared his throat. I don't suppose you have way to unlock the big door instead? That hole is pretty high up, and I think I broke a rib when I dash. Oh no. Tai Li cartwheeled back over to him, and gently rubbed the injured area that Sokka had been pointing at. You hurt yourself coming to save me. Here, let me help. Mai couldn't be sure in this light, but she thought Sokka was blushing as he stammered, Mai she wrapped it up pretty good, so well, unless you're that tickles a waterbender, then, what are you doing? Mai walked over to get a better look. Tai Li had leaned over so that her face was right next to Sokka's injured side, and she was staring with a serious expression. She held a hand out and said, I need 3 needles. Mai retrieved the weapons from her belt, but hesitated before handing them over. You're not going to bleed him out, are you? No, the nuns taught me a lot about healing. I'm going to fix his chi flow with acupuncture. The only reason Mai didn't dismiss the notion outright was because Tai Li was probably the most knowledgeable person around when it came to chi paths and meridians. She knew exactly where to poke to shut down a person's limbs, or even bending, in the midst of high-speed combat. Mai handed over the needles, and Tai Li immediately plunged them in quick succession through Sokka's bandages and clothes deep enough to pierce his body. Sokka yelped and went stiff, of course, but after a moment he let out a heavy breath and relaxed again. Hey, that feels a lot better. Tai Li nodded. That should straighten out your energy flow, so you'll be in less pain. Oh, and it will make you heal faster with regular treatments. But just because it hurts less doesn't mean that it's okay to stress it. It's still broken. She stood up again and put her face right up in Sokka's. So don't go straining yourself. Let the girls keep you safe, okay? Sokka gave a single short nod. Mai covered her smirk with a hand. Sokka's attitude problems were nothing compared to the power of a flirty girl, it seemed. It was amazing having Tai Li back. Maybe, with her help, they could do this. Maybe Aang and Katara were alive after all. Maybe they could save these airbenders, and get Aang the knowledge he needed to fix the world. No problem. That thought caused Mai to frown. Optimism was a good way to get killed. Sokka hadn't been able to climb up to the hole in the ceiling, even with the bedding from Tai Li's prison bedroom all tied together in the form of a ladder. Mai's perky friend had scrambled up first with a series of leaps and springs, carrying the sheet ladder, and then she lowered it down. Since climbing put too much strain on Sokka's broken rib, he was forced to cling to Mai's back while she climbed up for both of them, which of course wasn't completely humiliating at all. Once they were once again outside the fortress, Sokka was able to get a good look at their position for the first time. They were on top of a tower, rising up from a complex at the bottom of the sinkhole that was half oppressive fortress and half evil castle. Leave it to the Fire Nation to go for that kind of look. Sokka glanced over at Tai Li. She and Mai were conferring, and he distinctly heard the latter mention, airbenders. So they were figuring out their next destination, all without Sokka. He couldn't deny that it made sense. They both knew Fire Nation stuff better than him, and Ty Lee had even gotten a look at this exact fortress when she had been brought in. Ty Lee was everything they needed right now. She could fight on Mai's level, helped with his rib, was going to lead them to the airbenders, and then could help them escape. She was friendly, and more than a little beautiful. But she was Fire Nation. Sokka found himself not wanting to trust her. Mai trusted her unconditionally. But did Sokka trust Mai that much? The girls apparently finished their planning, and Mai started to climb down the tower. Ty Lee came over with the sheet ladder again and smiled. "We're going to make you a harness and lower you down. Hold still." "So, Ty Lee," Sokka said as she worked. "Can I ask you a question?" "Sure, anything you want. But I can't promise I'll tell you anything." Sokka felt his face heat up. How did she do that with such innocuous words? "Well, Ma, that is to say, the source that sent us here said, well, they mentioned a traitor who had we don't really know what the traitor did, but obviously traitors are never a good thing to have around, right?" "That's a really good question." Sokka pretended she was agreeing and went on, "So, do you know anything about this traitor? Name, accomplishments, address, that kind of thing?" Ty Lee stood up and cocked her head to the side. "I don't know anything about any kind of traitors. It's probably better to not think about that kind of thing, right?" "Yeah." Sokka tugged his makeshift harness. "Sure." When they all finally got down to another roof, Ty Lee pointed to a low installation at the center of the fortress. "That's where the airbenders should be." Sokka looked around at the rest of the base, and noticed all the soldiers moving in groups through the lanes on heightened patrol. He looked up and saw plenty more searches going on all over the walkways running up and down the sinkhole's walls. Only the scale and complexity of the fortress had probably saved Sokka and the girls from being spotted. Someone could look out from above in this red light and miss a few small figures scurrying across the tops of the buildings. Heh, so much for Fire Nation ingenuity. Okay. Sokka stepped over to the edge of the roof. "We'll need to play this smart. Since I'm injured, I'll stay here. You girls will make your way to the prison across the rooftops, but only when I give an all-clear signal. As long as I'm stuck here, I'll be your spotter and make sure no one is looking while you move. Once you're at the prison, I've noticed that all these buildings use the same ventilation technology as the base at the South Pole, so Ty Lee should be able to make her way through if you're even half as flexible as you seem and get to the airbenders. You free them, and Mai can hit the guards at the front door, so you'll both will work your way to each other, and then once the way is clear come back and get me and we'll see about how we're going to get out of this stupid sinkhole. Sound like a plan?" Before either girl could respond, something hot and flamey exploded behind Sokka. He spun around to find Fire Nation soldiers scrambling up ladders and dropping down from elevators to his rooftop. Standing tall on a ramp just above the whole scene was none other than Commander Zhao himself in all his sideburny glory. "Well, slush," Sokka said. Chapter 32, New Friends. Aang stood in a fortress of ice that might soon become his tomb. He raised his crystal lantern a little higher, trying to hold it so that the ice pillars around him caught and reflected more of the light. It was a marginal improvement, but that only meant that he could see Katara's worried expression more clearly as she used her waterbending to reinforce the existing ice from the water that still filled the cave up to his knees. As soon as she finished, Katara sagged. "That should do it for now." Aang knew the feeling. The lantern was heavy in his hand as he said, "We can't keep this up forever. We're either going to run out of air or the cave-in will shift enough that the ice won't be able to hold it up anymore." A drop of melting ice plopped down on Katara's head. She had lost her hat in the cave-in as she nodded. Aang let his gaze fall to the dark waters around him. The worst part wasn't even the danger that he and Katara were in, it was not knowing what had happened to Mai and Sokka. They had jumped through the hole Aang had cut into the tunnel wall, right into the red light of Tian Kang Fortress, but he hadn't even been able to see their feet touch the ground before the cave-in started. Katara's reflexes had been quick, and she had grabbed Aang's waist with one hand as she shoved the hand down at the water running through the tunnel, resulting in something like a small explosion that had sent them both flying backwards. The collapsing ceiling had followed them, though, and overtook them even before Aang's airbending-assisted running could them back to the surface. Only quick thinking and panicked icebending had saved their lives. Temporarily. But at least their final moments would be peaceful. Who knew what was happening to Sokka and Mai? They had a whole Fire Nation fortress to fight, and they had been on the verge of turning on each other for a while now. Aang had a bad feeling about their chances. Katara came over and put her hands on his shoulders. "You're worried about them?" He nodded. Katara pulled him into a hug, an embrace that felt all the warmer for the ice water surrounding them. "I believe in them. Sokka worked for 10 years and crossed the whole world to help me. He'll find a way. Even if it's too late for us, he'll get himself and Mai out of trouble. He's a pretty reliable guy, in certain ways." Aang wondered if he could just let himself believe that. It didn't really matter what he or Katara thought if they couldn't get out, but sharing her optimism would be a comfort before the end, at least. He opened his mouth to say something in reply. What, exactly, he didn't know, but then the little fortress tomb of ice shook, and he looked up to see what he expected to be a mountain of rock coming down on him with finality, but instead a shaft of light fell down to illuminate him. There was a hole in the rock above him, and although it seemed to be a deep hole, a spot of color at the end glowed like the dawn sky. The silhouette of a man shifted into view to eclipse that dawn glow. "Ah, the Avatar child. What a fortunate surprise," he said in a deep, cultured voice. Aang noticed a long braid hanging over the speaker's shoulder. "It looks like you've started my work for me. Might my men and I be of some assistance?" Sokka raised his hands high above his head, making his broken rib twitch, but he clenched his jaw and focused through the pain. He couldn't be distracted now, with a whole platoon of fire jerks surrounding him. Most of them were above him, on the platforms and elevators that clung to the massive sinkhole's sides, but a growing number were approaching right in front of him. Sokka, Mai, and Ty Lee had been standing on the edge of the rooftop of one of the many sprawling buildings that made up the bottom level of Tian Kang Fortress, and what had once been a cozy if slightly suspicious solitude had become the worst party ever as more and more troops climbed up onto the roof under Commander Zhao's direction. But the fire jerks weren't attacking. Sokka looked around, and noted that despite all the arrows, spears, and cocked firebender fists at ready, the soldiers were being very disciplined and only ready to kill him 10 times over. They wanted at least part of Sokka's little group alive. Well, okay then. He could work with that. Standing very still with his arms above his head, Sokka whispered, "Can Ty Lee fight well?" Mai's voice came back equally soft, "Better than me. She's probably the second best weapon of the Fire Nation alive." "Ah," Ty Lee chirped. "Thanks. Oh, another one of those weapon things, huh? Well, in that case, Sokka's plan might actually have a remote chance of almost kind of working. Who's the first?" Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Mai shiver as both she and Ty Lee simultaneously said, "Piandao. Is he here?" "No." Mai sidled a little closer to him, while keeping her own dangerous hands up. "What are you planning?" Sokka looked back at the soldiers. Zhao motioned, and several firebenders began approaching with slow steps. Their fists were raised so that they could attack with only half a moment's notice, 3/4 of a moment on the upside. "Okay, we have one last chance. If you can sabotage the source of the natural gas powering all the sinkhole's lanterns, the lights go out and there's still a chance of getting to the airbenders even though everyone knows we're here. You probably won't make it without Ty Lee, but watch out because she's keeping a secret from you and I hope it's not the kind that leads to lies and betrayals." He heard Ty Lee give a squeak at that, but before she could start an argument, he pressed on, "Tell Katara I'm proud of her and please find a way to justify what I'm about to do." Mai got as far as saying, "What are you dash?" when Sokka turned around and shoved both her and Ty Lee so that they stumbled and fell right off the roof. Zhao shouted something and suddenly the air was filled with deadly things, but Sokka dropped to his knees and scrunched himself as small as he could get with a broken rib and his hands held up in what he hoped was an acceptable sign of surrender. Then something slammed into his back and crushed him down to the ground, making Sokka's broken rib scream and... No wait, that was him screaming. That idiot. That idiot. Mai wanted to call Sokka a lot worse things in her thoughts, but she was too distracted by the running fight with an entire army to get creative with her insults. From the moment he had shoved her off the roof, she had been forced to work to survive, kicking out against the fortress building's edifice to transform her straight drop into something like a rolling landing that rattled her bones and sent waves of pain through her already sore body. Then, from the moment she and Tai Li had touched the ground, they were at the center of a whole fortress's accumulated bad intentions. Spears and arrows and fireballs streaked down towards them while soldiers with swords and spears and staffs and chains and all kind of weapons rushed in at them. If she had been with anyone else, Mai wouldn't have survived it. But Tai Li was back from the dead. Sokka said she might be a traitor, and if a weapon of the Fire Nation was a person capable of fighting a small army, then she and Tai Li, Sokka said she might be a traitor, were ash-streaked, goose-ducking tanks of the Fire Nation when working together. After all, that's what Azula had wanted them to be, and Azula always got what she wanted. They didn't even need to make plans. Mai came up shooting bolts from her wrist launchers at the soldiers above who still had a viable vantage point. Those soldiers needed a few seconds to adjust their aim now that she and Tai Li, Sokka said she might be a traitor, weren't on the roof anymore, but in those few seconds her bolts snapped bowstrings and sunk into exposed fists and poked into all those little places that armor couldn't cover if its wearers wanted to move. Then she and Tai Li, Sokka said she might be a traitor, started running. They met a wave of soldiers, of course, but Tai Li, Sokka said she might be a traitor, didn't even have to slow down as she engaged the whole lot with her acrobatic dodges and jumps. Mai ignored the brawl because it was no danger to her. She trusted Tai Li, Sokka said she might be a traitor, to take down every soldier before a single one could so much as even think about making trouble. Instead, she kept her sharp eyes looking for distant threats, sending more bolts at distant attackers and noting the enemy reinforcements coming up the lane. Her body was sore and weary, but that was just background noise as she pushed herself into that perfect state where she was at the center of a world of targets and there was nothing was beyond her reach. Meanwhile, she knew that Tai Li was twisting and tumbling and leaping and spinning around her attackers, each movement coming with 3 or 4 fist strikes that landed in those same impossible-to-armor spaces that Mai liked to target. Tai Li's punches were far stronger than a girl her size and slimness should have been capable of, but the power behind them wasn't what made them dangerous. Tai Li didn't strike at muscle and bone, like Mai had to. She struck at the body's invisible power points, the spots where flows of chi converged and pumped. When Tai Li struck those points the chi was disrupted, so limbs fell dead and bending snuffed out and pain exploded into horrifying numbness. This all happened so fast that Mai didn't even need to slow her run, which was good because she wasn't sure she would be able to get back up to this speed. The soldiers fell and she called out, 15 degrees, 25 degrees, and 160 degrees, and continued on her shooting. And so Tai Li adjusted her run to match Mai's directions and found new battles to wage without having to stop and look for them. Azula had come up with that system. After all, as long as Mai needed to be looking at things in the distance and calculating vectors, why not figure out where Tai Li needed to take her magic fists next? It was a little more efficient, and Azula had always said that entire battles could be lost based on a few seconds worth of bad timing. With this pattern of attack, they made rapid progress through the bottom level of the fortress, and Mai was able to keep too busy to wonder if Sokka was right and the girl her life depended on right now was planning to betray her. An eternity and an army later, they reached the furnace station where coal would be burned in such a way as to release the flammable gas within, providing fuel for all of the fortress's lanterns and machinery. Mai and Tai Li plunged into the heat so that they could find a way to plunge the fortress into darkness. She hoped Sokka survived to see it. He said Tai Li might be a traitor. Mai's friend might be keeping harmful secrets from her. Is this how Sokka felt at Crescent Island? The tribal boy was obviously in pain, but he managed to grin as he was dragged onto the platform and said, "Commander Zhao. I just have to say that going all the way back to the South Pole, really I have always admired you as a leader and administrator. I even tried to grow sideburns like yours, but I just couldn't make them work as magnificently as you do." Zhao nodded to the guard holding onto the boy, and enjoyed it when she shoved an elbow into the tribal's side. When the boy stopped groaning, he brought the smile back. "So, my name is Sokka. What can I do for you?" Zhao glanced out over the sprawl of the fortress. He couldn't see Mai or Tai Li anymore, and was already composing a report that would blame Iroha's lack of orders for the latter's escape, but it seemed that the troops were converging on the mechanical sector. He frowned at the thought of the kind of damage a pair of weapons could do there, but at least they were still stuck on the bottom level of the sinkhole. Eventually they would be overwhelmed. Right? Zhao turned his attention back to the prisoner he actually had. The fortress's regular commanders could direct the troops just as well as he could, and he had real gains he could make here. I'm glad we could finally speak, Tribal Sokka. We have much to discuss. He expected the boy to play dumb or spit back some defiance, or maybe even just shut up. He didn't expect Sokka to nod and say, I have a feeling we have a lot of misconceptions to clear up. What do you want to know? Very well, Zhao would play the game for now. Who are you working for? The Avatar, unfortunately. He's the one who sets the agenda. And who is the Avatar working for? Sokka's eyes narrowed. Avatar Roku, I think. I'm not really sure how that works, though. Is he a ghost with his own opinions, or some kind of facet of Aang's mind that acts as a delivery method for subconsciously stored knowledge? Either way, it's spooky Avatar stuff. Zhao decided that the answer was too stupid to be fabricated. And what about Lady Caldera Yumai? Where do her orders come from? Oh, that's a whole thing. Sokka looked around, then leaned forward and spoke in a quiet voice, see, up until Crescent Island, she was working for you guys. Zhao suppressed a grin. He knew it. And what happened on Crescent Island? Well, she met up with the guy she was working for, Prince Zer, something with his E. He has one eye. This time, Zhao did grin. Prince Zuko. Yeah, that's the name. You're not a fan of him either, huh? Well, she found out that this Zuko guy is apparently an even bigger jerk than she is, so she kicked his butt and saved Aang. More or less. Now she says she's working for us, and I haven't seen evidence of that not being the case. And what was she supposed to do for Prince Zuko? Help him capture Aang. I think he's on a quest or something, and it would be a big glorious deal if he succeeded. So she joined up with us, helped us get away from all the other fireheads, and then told Zuko we were headed for Crescent Island so that he could ambush us himself. Zhao nodded. It all fit, all matched his theories. And if Mai had truly betrayed Zuko and Oze's faction with it, they had lost their link to the rest of the conspiracy. And what of the rebellions? Sokka blinked. Which ones? Your people rose up using the power of the Everstorm. Now you're traveling the Earth Kingdom, striking at Fire Nation forces. Oh. Okay, yeah, I see what you're getting at. So, see, that's where we get back into the Avatar junk. Roku told us that the war broke the world, so we're trying to fix it. That's why we're getting ghosts and monsters and ashlands and stuff. And new airbenders. The only reason we're fighting the Fire Nation is because you guys keep coming after us, and Aang likes to help anyone he feels sorry for. I know you have a beef with avatars since they don't like it when you steal the whole world from the people who are supposed to share it, but it would actually be better for you if you let us take care of these problems. You can't enjoy dealing with monsters any more than we do. Zhao sighed. And so the flow of information ended. Yes, I'm sure you'd like me to think that. But don't worry, we'll have the opportunity to discuss your true purposes now that you're in my power. He nodded, and the soldier started to drag Sokka away. That's when the lights started going out. It was like the stars were leaving the night sky as one by one the lanterns throughout the sinkhole faded into darkness. It started at the top of the vertical fortress and worked its way down. A blanket of shadow descended on everything, broken up only by the few solid fuel torches scattered throughout the structure. Some of the firebenders on active duty brought up their own flames, but it was a futile struggle. When Zhao had ordered the fortress put on complete lockdown, the top of the sinkhole had been covered by a system of linking platforms that formed an armored lid, cutting off any view of the sky and what would by now be a dawning sun. They were sealed in a pit beyond the light of the outside world, and it could get very dark beneath the ground. Zhao raised a hand and chased away the darkness that had covered this particular platform with a small ball of flame. He immediately looked in the direction that the guard had been dragging the tribal Sokka, and found that they had paused when the lights went out. The tribal himself was maintaining a carefully blank expression. Noticing Zhao's stare, Sokka blinked. What? I didn't say anything. Mai sighed in the darkness. Well, I'm out of bolts, and I'm down to only 7 blades. At least I still have my sword. The sabotage of the gas supplier had gotten hairy, since survival was no longer just a matter of running and striking. Mai and Ty Lee had been forced to take cover behind machinery and strike when even the narrowest opportunity presented itself. It was tense work, and each attack had spent a little more of the desperate strength Mai was forcing into her body. About the only thing that had gone smoothly was the sabotage itself, thanks to her experience aboard Fire Nation warships when her family had been touring the world before their journey to the South Pole. The coal burners here had worked on the same principle as the ones aboard the ship, and supplied gas to the lanterns through the same kind of pipe-based distribution system. Ty Lee had acted as defense while Mai had gone about breaking machinery, and the ensuing darkness had allowed them to escape the building and finally evade their pursuers. There were enough torches and firebenders to produce a very dim ambient light in places, but it was just enough to avoid walking into walls. Mai and Ty Lee had put some distance between themselves and any patrols, and had sat down beside a supply shed for a rest and maybe some planning. They just had to figure out, now, how to free the airbenders. And find Sokka. Katara and Aang wouldn't like it if they thought Mai had traded their brother for an old Fire Nation friend. She had to bite back another curse for that Water Tribe moron's overblown sense of responsibility. What did he think he was accomplishing? Even if she found the airbenders, it wasn't like they'd have a herd of sky bison with them that could carry everyone out of the sinkhole. It was a pointless sacrifice, and she would probably die trying to give it meaning. She heard Ty Lee shift somewhere beside her, and then her friend said, "Seems like we're clear to get going again." No torches, and no auras glowing in the dark. Mai would have rolled her eyes if she thought the detail would be visible. "I don't believe in auras, and I certainly don't believe that if they did exist you would be able to see them in the dark." "Then how do I know what a sour yellow color your aura is right now?" There was enough ambient light that Mai could see Ty Lee's head tilt to the side, and long experience filled in the amusement that was supposed to go with it. "Come on, the prison is just over this way." They joined hands, and Mai suppressed a groan as her sore muscles protested being on the move again. As they flitted down the lane, the ground gave a shake beneath their feet. It had been doing that every so often since they stopped for a rest, and Mai could only hope that her sabotage to the gas system wasn't going to destroy the whole sinkhole. At least, not before she and Ty Lee found a way to get the airbenders and Sokka out of here. She was relying on Ty Lee, just like when they sparred together before their lives had dragged them apart. Back then, they had kept no secrets from each other. Mai knew all about Ty Lee's family, about her issues with being a septuplet, about her mother's addiction, about her father's apathy. Ty Lee in turn knew what Mai had been like before she found her courage, about the punishments she got speaking out of turn in public, about her anger when Tom Tom was born. They had both trained with the princess, and had learned together where the Azula's boundaries could be found. And now after knowing her for just half an escape attempt, Sokka claimed that Ty Lee was keeping secrets. Only the fact that his stupid plan had worked out so far gave Mai any doubts. So she decided to go ahead and prove him wrong. "Hey. Yeah. What aren't you telling me?" Ty Lee froze. She turned around, and Mai could almost make out the glistening of her eyes in the glint of distant torches. "Please. Please what? Please don't ask me that." Mai's stomach flipped. Sokka was right. Kind of. "Oh, no." Mai shut her eyes against the sight of her friend's silhouette and yanked her hand away. Sokka was right. That moron was still right. He was right about everything. Ty Lee had secrets, sinkhole fortresses needed lamps to operate, digging tunnels with water was a bad idea, Mai couldn't be trusted with anything, and all their plans were destined for failure. Maybe next time he told her to take a flying leap off of Appa, she'd go ahead and do it. If she ever saw Appa again, of course. "Oh, why do I bother? I'm sorry." "You're supposed to dash." She bit off the rest of the thought, that her only friend was supposed to be better than an honorless maverick like Mai, but why bother saying it? Reality didn't care what it was supposed to be. "What?" Ty Lee's voice was quivering. "What am I supposed to do?" "Never mind." She opened her eyes and forced her face back into a neutral expression before she remembered that Ty Lee couldn't see it anyway. She wondered if she was supposed to pull a weapon on her friend now. Don't you have something that you want to say? I'm sorry. Tai Li's voice had gone hoarse, a telltale sign for those that knew her that she was deeply stressed. I really am. The squeak of the last word was like a hot needle down Mai's throat, and she found herself hissing, "You're not supposed to lie and betray your friends and dash." Whoa, wait. Tai Li lunged forward and grabbed Mai's shoulders with soft hands. Her breath splashed against Mai's face. I didn't betray any friends. I'm not betraying you. I did something bad. Really bad. I don't want anyone to know about it. I know that's stupid and you're going to find out, but Mai heard her friend's breath hitch. I don't want you to look at me like I'm a monster. At least for a little while longer. Please, let me keep my secret? It won't hurt you. I'd never hurt you. I love you. The ground gave another shake. Mai sighed. Tai Li loved everything she didn't actively dislike, and she could be just as catty and hurtful as Angela when she was cranky, but the truth of the words didn't matter. Tai Li couldn't actively lie. At worst, she could just say incorrect things that she honestly believed, but mostly she just avoided talking about anything that made her uncomfortable. She was mistaken about a lot of things like auras, but that was because she was as dumb as a bag of rocks. Mai was supposed to be the smart one, of the two of them, and she knew that right now she was being dumb as well. Just because she hated herself didn't mean she had to hate Tai Li, too. She breathed out, expelling all the stale air in her lungs. Okay, fine. Okay. That's what I said. Keep your secret for now. Mai couldn't help but wonder if Tai Li had done something to sell out the Oze faction. If so, it had probably been an accident. And when it comes out and you're revealed as the monster you are, I'll be glad that you're not the dippy pink clown you've always acted like. The darkness was silent for a long moment, and then Tai Li gave a laugh and Mai was suddenly being hugged to death. Thank you. You're the best person I ever knew who likes to dress like Swamp Spirit. She patted her friend's shoulder. Yeah, pink auras all around. Now let's go free these airbenders and figure out if the plan we don't have has a next step. Once again traveling hand in hand, they reached the prison without incident, aside from the intermittent trembles from the ground, where another full platoon of soldiers was waiting with torches and handheld lanterns. They hid themselves well short of the light, taking cover behind the foundations of a tower of some kind, and then both peeked out to discern the enemy numbers and positions. There were no more than 24, arranged in a fairly sensible defensive formation all across the front of the prison. No doubt there was a full guard staff inside, as well. Once she was satisfied, Mai gave Tai Li's hand a squeeze and let go to unsheath her sword, and then they both dashed into battle again. The soldiers didn't know they were under attack until Tai Li dropped out of a massive leap behind their front lines. When they turned to face her, Mai's blades struck home. As the fight dissolved into elegant chaos, Mai acted as the eyes of the team. While Tai Li flipped and cartwheeled into each fight, Mai hung back and kept track of the wider situation. The torches and lanterns the soldiers were carrying made their carriers easy targets, and she only had to dash, jump, roll, and even kick off the building's face to appear instantly at the side of anyone who thought to strike at Tai Li while she was distracted. Each time someone rose against her friend, Mai would swing her sword against them. The armor they wore wasn't a problem, because she didn't need or want to kill anyone. She could slash at exposed faces, stab at unshielded joints, and shove at anyone in an unbalanced stance. It was enough to temporarily disable her targets, because Tai Li would soon be there to shut down their joints and disable them on a more long-term basis. Then they both slipped back into the shadows and struck again from a different angle before their disappearance had even fully registered. In the end, Mai and Tai Li left behind a pile of not quite dead bodies as they entered the prison and locked the front door behind them. They weren't locked in with the prison's guards, the guards were locked in with them. As Mai turned around in the darkness of the building's vestibule, her boots splashed in a thin puddle of water that had somehow accumulated on the floor. Sokka had spent a lot of his time, back in the South Pole, imagining what course his life would take. Even now, traveling with as part of some kind of wandering hero group, he tried to anticipate the various fates that might await him. Despite what Aang might think, thinking on the fly was a good way to run over a cliff. Even so, Sokka never expected to be chatting in Commander Zhao's tower office by candlelight. It could almost have been a parody of something romantic if Zhao weren't threatening light Sokka's hair on fire between questions. I repeat, where are the other Water Tribe refugees hiding, and what aid have you all received from mainland rebels? Zhao was standing somewhere behind Sokka's chair, and he could feel the heat of a flame against the back of his neck. Sokka groaned. Look, Commander, I have two ways I can answer this. Either I can make up something that sounds true so that you get off my back, or I can repeat the answer I've been giving to this question for the 10th time and say that I have no idea because I immediately took off with the Avatar to go make trouble elsewhere. At this point, I'm going to let you make the call. You think you're clever, don't you? Well, I never thought I was recruited to the South Pole Laboratory for my singing voice. As soon as he finished speaking, Sokka realized that he might have been getting a bit too mouthy considering that fire still held near his neck. He cringed as much as he could without irritating his broken rib. Then the office door slid open to reveal a panting aide with a handheld lantern. Commander, we have a problem. Sokka was professionally interested in all of the Fire Nation's problems, especially any that would have flunkies running up all the flights of the tower's stairs to deliver a report, and so listened as Zhao stepped into view with a scowl on his ugly, sideburn-framed face to say, "Is this about the traitor girls?" "No, sir. Guards on the base level are reporting dash. Are you telling me no one has managed to find them yet? Is this a fortress or a day spa?" "Sir, please, the girls are holed up in the prison building, and 2 whole platoons are surrounding it now, but we're also getting dash." "Then what about the lights, why haven't they been fixed yet?" The aide grimaced, and Sokka almost felt sorry for winding Zhao up like this, but the woman soldiered on and said, "Those girls did a lot of damage to the piping around the furnaces, and the system is building up a lot of pressure. The technicians say they have to divide their efforts between repairs and just keeping more damage from accumulating." "But sir, we're also getting reports of heavy flooding on the base level." Zhao blinked. "Flooding? You mean water is coming up through the floor?" Sokka himself was thinking of the water that had been running underground in this whole region, the water that Katara and Aang had used to carve a tunnel straight into the sinkhole's interior. What had happened to it after the cave-in? He couldn't imagine that their little waterbending venture was now flooding the whole massive sinkhole. To push up through the metal plates that were supposedly covering the whole bottom of the fortress, there had to be a lot of water accumulating. He also thought about all the equipment here in the fortress, and what the aide had said about the repairs to the gas system. He stood up. "I think you should consider evacuating. Right now." Zhao glanced over at him, sneered, and gestured at the aide. "Get this tribal out of here. Perhaps he'll be more helpful after being locked in a dark supply closet for a day or two." Sokka found himself taking a step towards the commander, but the aide's hands clamped down on his shoulders with enough force to make his broken rib twinge again. "You don't, HRG, understand, that water will be cold, and if it gets into the equipment you're trying to fix, there could be a huge reaction." The aide yanked, making Sokka cry out, but then the fire in Zhao's hand suddenly went out, leaving only the candles and the aide's lantern to keep darkness from completely filling the little office. "Wait," Zhao barked. The aide relented, and in the dim light Sokka found Zhao looking at him with wide eyes. "Yeah. How huge a reaction?" There was a clap like thunder outside the tower office, and it felt like the whole sinkhole shuddered in sympathy. Sokka just had time to say, "That huge," when something smacked into the tower with enough force to knock them all off their feet. The candles all went out at the same time that gravity decided to try some new things, and Sokka's world became nothing but darkness and pain. Hunting through the prison building of Tiankang Fortress was almost too easy, even as tired and pained as Mai was. Just like outside, the guards were forced to carry torches to see anything, giving away their positions. Their every step through the puddles of water on the floor echoed through the claustrophobic corridors, revealing their every movement. Whenever Mai lunged at them from the darkness, her sword extended like a monster's talons, she saw fear explode on their faces just before she struck. She had more than enough time to pick non-fatal targets, and in the few events where she missed at first, Ty Lee was soon coming in low and snap a punch into unarmored thighs to remove the guard's ability to stand. The last one flopped to the ground with a splash and a wail, and Mai caught his torch before it could finish falling. She stretched her arms to try to work some life back into them as the ground shook again. All right, I give up. What's with the water and the quakes? Does that happen often? Ty Lee shook her head in the light of the torch. Not that I've ever noticed. Do you think we did something when we closed off those pipes for the gas? So even Ty Lee was thinking on those lines. Maybe, but there's no reason there should be water down here because of that. She thought back to Katara's plan to get into the sinkhole. Maybe this was a sign that she and Aang were alive? Whatever's going on, it would probably be best if we hurried. She looked down hallway to the door at the end. One room left. Ty Lee turned to look, and even in the haphazard glow of the torch, her expression fell noticeably. If there's one room left, then they must be in there, right? Along with whoever else is being kept prisoner, yes. And there might be a last guard or two. Mai shifted her grip on the torch so that she could throw it like one of her knives if needed. I'll go through first, you follow and save me from whatever we find. Ty Lee nodded, and they started forward. They barely got 2 steps before the whole world shook and the entire building rocked down into a tilt that slammed Mai into the wall on her left. She dropped the torch, and it sputtered as it landed in a puddle and its light almost went out. She quickly picked it back up. Most of the material was wet and refused to burn now, but a section still maintained a flame. I have a bad feeling about this. Nevertheless, she forced herself back into motion. When she reached the door, she started by giving it a good kick. She was fairly sure that her boots were thick enough to protect her from breaking her foot if the door was locked, but it proved to be a moot point. The door flew open when she struck it, and she dove into the darkened room and drew her sword. She landed in a crouch and moved the torch around to shed light in one direction at a time, but the only company she found was the shrieking and cowering women behind the bars of the cells. Mai rose up and sheathed her sword again. There were 4 cells, and the women, their ages ranging from girls her own age to Mother Malu's contemporaries, occupied 3 of them. They all wore the same set of robes, heavy things of white and gold that even recently might have been clean and in good repair. Now, they were streaked with the unmistakable stains of ash, torn and burned in ways that spoke of a sudden and inadequate education in combat. The women blinked against the slim torchlight, and made sounds of fear. Mai sighed. Hi. She poked into her belt to produce the set of keys she had taken from one of the guards. I'm guessing that you're Mother Malu's airbenders. Potential issues about quality aside, this is a rescue. To a chorus of relieved sighs, Mai went to unlock the first cell. One of the nearby women, who looked in the torchlight to have quite a few years on Mai, said, I am Sister Madagi. Our abbess sent you. And the avatar. The lock clicked, and Mai stepped back as the door swung open. As much as I'd like to personally meet each and every one of you to exchange stories, we're in a rush. I need you to keep everyone organized and moving, okay? She didn't wait for Madagi's reply before moving on to the second lock. It wasn't until Mai was unlocking the 3rd cell that she realized that Ty Lee hadn't come into the room with her. She looked back at the door, but the light of the torch didn't reach that far. She pushed her way through the nuns and Madagi gathered them in her wake. Mai, however, only had eyes for the empty doorway. Where had Ty Lee gone? It didn't turn out to be a long search. Mai only had to walk down that first corridor, Madagi and the others hurrying after her, when she found Ty Lee leaning against a wall in the dark. Ty Lee, came Madagi's almost horrified wail. For a moment, Mai was trying to remember how she could have mentioned her friend to the nun, but then she remembered that Ty Lee had been sheltered at the abbey, and the airbenders would all know her. Ty Lee gave a wan smile and waved. Glad you're all okay. The silence that followed prompted Mai to turn around and raise her torch. The nuns were all glaring at Ty Lee, some with thin-lipped anger and others with wide-eyed hurt. Did this have to do with her secret, the one that would supposedly make Mai look on her as a monster? The ground shook again, once again sending her stumbling into a wall, but at least this time she held onto the torch, despite the exhaustion nipping at her heels. Then there was a lurch and suddenly the whole building was in free fall. It didn't last long, maybe not even a second, and ended with a crash that broke gravity. Mai found herself floating during the fall. Perhaps this was what it felt like to be a sky bison, and instinctively let go of the torch and pulled her limbs in before her sudden landing. She wound up in a crouch that still had enough momentum to turn into a tumble, but the floor decided that it didn't want to stay put, and suddenly gravity was pulling her towards the prison's front door, making her slide across a flat floor that had become a downward ramp, and then another jolt sent her rolling towards a wall that suddenly became a new floor, and finally Maya was dumped shoulder first up against the locked front door just before gravity shifted so that she was lying on the world's first door floor. It hurt, but she was too tired to do anything more. Groan. A light descended on her, and Maya looked up to find Tai Li skidding to a safe stop with the recovered torch in her hand. As the nuns, all them landing softer than Maya had managed but not as gracefully as the professional acrobat from the Fire Nation, came to a stop around them, Tai Li helped Maya to her feet and said, "You okay?" "Okay enough to not give you a real answer." Maya stepped to the side of the door so that she wasn't standing directly on it, and crouched down to undo the lock. She doubted there were any soldiers waiting outside now, which was one nice benefit of the scary disasters. How about everyone else? All airbenders accounted for. Madajai conferred with them for a moment, and then announced, "We are well enough. But please, what's going on? What happened to the building? And why is Tai Li with you? I thought Mother Malu sent you." "Tai Li is my partner. Any problems you have with her can wait until we're all out of here." As for the building, the lock finally came undone, and the doors popped open to reveal a swirling, muddy rapids some distance below. The doors swung in the empty air, and the whole building creaked with disturbing promise. "I don't know, but I think the whole sinkhole is dying and we're stuck in it." Reality came back to Sokka with the sound of angry cursing and the distant echoes of rushing water. He stretched, made a high-pitched sound when he was reminded of his broken rib, and opened his eyes to see what new disaster he had fallen into. He was still in Zhao's office and the lights were still out. Zhao himself was still here, standing on the other side of the room. A military flare hissed on the floor at Zhao's feet, filling the office with harsh red light and revealing that everything seemed to have picked up an unusual case of the sideways. Sokka blinked a few times, tilted his head, and blinked some more. Yes, the room was sideways. He was willing to bet that was the reason the furniture was all thrown around in a pretty sorry state. Either that or he had slept through Zhao giving a truly legendary tantrum. What happened? Zhao turned around just as a rope snaked down through a hole in the ceiling. No, that was the window that had originally looked out over the sinkhole behind him. "Ah, you're alive. Are you in any state to climb, tribal?" Sokka bit back his annoyance at the slur and said, "I have a broken rib. I don't think I can." "Oh." Zhao shrugged, grabbed the rope, and tied it around his waist. "Too bad. You would have made a useful prisoner." He tugged the rope once, and was quickly lifted up through the window and out of sight. What a jerk. No, seriously, what a jerk. Sokka got up and went over to the space beneath that ceiling window. Looking up, he could see a steady stream of torches moving up the sinkhole's dark ramps, with shadow that might have been Zhao rising up towards a crane lit by its own set of military flares. Sokka squinted and looked for other flares, taking in what details were revealed by the harsh light. Those details all told the same story. Tiankang Fortress was in pretty sorry shape. Equipment was thrown around, ramps and scaffolding were broken, and everyone seemed to be in a big hurry to go up. The flares seemed to be congregated around the remaining functioning equipment, all of it fairly high up. And there was still that matter of the echoing water. Sokka had a hard time believing that Aang and Katara's waterbending had somehow managed to destroy a whole mile-deep sinkhole in a single night, but until he got other data, it was his only theory. And if the Fire Nation was evacuating, then he probably should make that his mission, too. He proceeded to scour the sideways office, hoping to find a whole sky bison hidden beneath the crushed desk and scattered papers, but was predictably disappointed. There were no ladders, either, and even the few chairs were in pieces. If he could find some string or binding agent, maybe he could cobble together something he could climb, but even without a broken rib he'd be hard-pressed with these materials. Maybe if he leaned some of the larger pieces against the wall, he could. The soft sound of stone scraping against stone somewhere above him pulled Sokka straight out of his musings. He looked up and in the light of the flare found a man in a long robe and cone hat crouching on the ceiling. Sokka blinked, and quickly scanned the room around him. The office was still sideways, the ceiling had once been a wall, the wall to his left had once been a floor, Gravity was still pulling things down, and how was this guy sitting on the new ceiling? The man peered down with an expression like a tundra hawk's. Are you Sokka of the Southern Water Tribe? Sokka blinked. Yes. Yes, I am. Did Aang and Katara send you? I'm not at liberty to say. The man's face was about as expressive as Mai's. Do you require assistance? Sokka shrugged as carefully as he could to avoid stressing his broken rib. If you don't have anything better to do. The man nodded once and then dropped down from the ceiling straight onto Sokka's head. He tried to get out of the way, but the man was reaching for him, and then stone hands clamped down on his throat and he tried to fight back, but his head became heavy and the light of flare receded into oblivion. Mai looked up to see Ty Lee grinning down at her in the torchlight. She groaned, reached up with a trembling hand, and was quickly grabbed and pulled the rest of the way to solid ground. Well, Mai said as she collapsed on the floor, that was kind of terrible. And it truly had been. Back down in the prison, she had sent Ty Lee to climb out with the torch to see if she could find a way to safety that didn't involve falling into muddy rapids. That had left Mai sitting in absolute darkness with the airbender nuns, and while she had been tempted to start a conversation about their reaction to Ty Lee, her inability to see who she would be talking to had made her even less eager to converse with other human beings than normal. So instead she listened to the nuns talk amongst themselves, using names like Hini and Keiki and Ipio and Anahira and Vea and Alani and whatever. Eventually, Ty Lee came back and described the grueling climb that would allow them to make their way down and around the prison building, which had fallen to wedge in a brand new mini sinkhole within the big sinkhole, and up into the main chamber. The only good news had been the confirmation that no soldiers had stuck around to see if anyone in the prison survived. So they had all climbed by the light of a single dying torch. The airbenders were practiced enough with their new elements to make some rather effective giant leaps, but Mai had been forced to climb up the old-fashioned way. Ty Lee had helped, of course, but now that Mai was back on solid ground, she realized that she was done. Or, more accurately, her body was done. Her limbs were so weak she doubted she could throw a knife further than her own toes even if she had any blades left. Every inch of her was sore and tender from the various falls and beatings she had taken. She had a headache, and of course she was just filthy. It was just as well that she had cut up her green robe because it was probably a lost cause after everything else, and not doing up her hair anymore was seeming like a better decision every second. Mai just plain had no more fight in her. And now Ty Lee and Madagi and all the other nuns were looking at her for the next step in her daring escape plan. Mai sighed, but it was lost in the noise of the rushing water coming from the pit behind her. We can't stay down here. We need to find a ramp and do our best to stay out of sight of the local traffic. Speaking of the local traffic, Mai wondered if the Fire Nation had bothered to evacuate Sokka. Was he even alive, or had whatever was killing the sinkhole killed him, too? She could only imagine meeting up with Katara again, passing on his last message, and noting that the last she had seen him was at the bottom of the sinkhole of doom. Madagi looked at the other airbenders and stepped forward in the torchlight. And if we're able to find a way up, what then? We saw when we were led into the fortress that the Fire Nation has defenses stretching all around the sinkhole. Do you know a way past them? The question made Mai want to burst into tears, but she kept her face blank. One step at a time. I might have allies outside waiting for us. She got moving before Madagi could ask any more questions. Ty Lee quickly trotted up beside her. Do you really? I thought you said dash. I'm not inconsiderate like Sokka, Mai interrupted. So I'm letting you know right now that there's a possibility I'm going to have to leave the nuns in your care. I might need to take care of some things only I can do. If that happens, will there be a problem with you taking command of the nuns? Ty Lee looked away. They don't seem to like me anymore. Nothing else was said, and Mai let it be. The journey across the bottom of the sinkhole was the longest walk of Mai's life. Or so it seemed. The sinkhole continued to shake as they went, and the damage that had already been wreaked by the seismic activity had turned the whole area into a wasteland. None of the land was flat anymore. New streams and geysers had dampened the place up considerably. Some buildings had sunk like the prison, leaving behind gurgling holes, while others were covered with debris. Some of the wreckage looked like it came from the fortress towers that had risen above the rest of installation. Mai felt even more tired at the thought that Sokka's dead body might be buried in some of that debris. For all Mai knew, she was the last member of their little group still alive. For all she knew, she'd soon be joining them. The thought lodged in her mind and wouldn't go away. She had faced death many times already, not the least of which was when she had been ready to sacrifice herself for Aang's survival after Crescent Island had erupted, but at least that had been her choice. This situation now just seemed like the culmination of 1,000 mistakes, a marathon of bad judgment that looked just enough like a workable situation to keep her going until she finally reached a dead end. She continued to lead the others across the sinkhole floor, but her walk was more like a continuous stumble, and she was pretty sure that if she stopped, she'd fall to the ground and never get back. So she kept going, and nearly died when the ground beneath her shifted, collapsing and dumping her into free fall. It happened so fast, and her body was so sluggish, that she never had time to react. She just fell with a gasp, plummeting into darkness. She had only enough time to register the sound of more rushing water somewhere below when the air around her came alive, slowing her fall and pushing her into a lazy drift. Then strong but thin arms wrapped around her waist and a body was pressed against hers while the air shifted direction. It was almost like being back in Aang's arms, riding the winds with on the ash-filled winds of Crescent Island, and her savior even kicked off a wall in a similar way to gain altitude. Mai closed her eyes and wondered if she had in fact died, and Aang was the one sent to carry her into the reincarnation cycle. Then she landed with a jolt on cold hard ground, and the pain convinced her that such a mercy had not been granted. Mai opened her eyes and looked around. The nuns were gathered and Madagi was holding the torch. Mai was back on the sinkhole's main floor, and there was a new pit beside her that she had apparently fallen into. One of the nuns must have caught her, which was unusually quick thinking but... Mai turned around to look at the person whose arms were still around her waist, and found herself gazing into goldish-gray eyes that were all too familiar. Despite her exhaustion, Mai's mind snapped into motion, Ty Lee's secret, the shame she had displayed, the promise that she would never betray her friends, the worry that she would be considered a monster, it all made sense now. First fire, Mai hissed at Ty Lee. You're an airbender. Chapter 33, Bury the Old. For all his power, Aang felt useless for far more often than was fair. He had thought, when his new earthbender friends saved him and Katara from the collapsed tunnel, that he'd be able to rush into the Fire Nation's sinkhole immediately to help Mai and Sokka. But the Tian Kang fortress hadn't gotten any less dangerous in the time Aang spent trapped, and his rescuers asked to try infiltrating the fortress secretly on their own, and as a point in their favor, they hadn't caused any cave-ins recently. So Aang agreed, and kept himself busy helping Katara see to Mother Malu, Appa, and Momo. He had spent the last few hours making sure that the old airbender woman still slept comfortably, that Appa was calm and ready to fly, and that Momo didn't eat too much before what could be a quick getaway. He had tried to wait patiently, watching as the leader of the earthbenders got reports from his agents. They all wore dark robes and cone hats with a golden spike at the top, and always maintained a calm demeanor, even when the ground shook and they'd coming hurrying up to give whispered reports. Aang had tried to distract himself by brushing out Appa's fur, but the shaking was getting worse, and loud sounds were starting to carry through the earth. Finally, Aang put the brush down and went over to talk to Long Feng. The man was having another quiet conversation with a pair of his people when Aang walked up and said, "Is there anything I can do to help? If anyone's in trouble Yana like Sokka or Mai I can bring Appa and we'll fly them out dash." "Oh no, Avatar." Long Feng turned smoothly from his subordinates, the long queue of hair that fell down from the back of his balding head barely swaying from the movement, and his voice was a soothing purr. "I wouldn't dream of asking you to risk yourself in such a dangerous situation. My people are handling the difficulties dash." Difficulties. The word stuck out to Aang like a lifeline. What difficulties? What's going on down there? You said before that you had a plan. Long Feng's smile faded. He turned to his subordinates, whispered a few words, and sent them away with a wave of his hand before turning back to Aang. "Walk with me, Avatar. As you discovered with your attempt to dig into the sinkhole, this region is unstable enough that most earthbenders risk destabilizing the entire area. Just finding a way to safely displace the underground water is a difficult task. You rather resourcefully found a way to use that for your benefit, and even that didn't go very well. Aang winced. I'm really glad you found me in Katara. I am, too, Avatar. In any event, my people use a style of earthbending more precise and subtle than most, which we were going to use to infiltrate the fortress, retrieve the information we were looking for along with your friends, now that we know about them, and then sabotage the fortress. Long Feng brought his hands together within his wide sleeves, a stance that Aang had seen Mai take with habitual frequency. In fact, Aang was starting to notice that Long Feng controlled his face a lot like Mai, keeping it blank as he continued. Unfortunately, the fortress has suffered a major equipment failure of some kind. The Fire Nation's strange machinery has exploded. The work of my earthbenders has started collapsing, and the sinkhole is growing deeper and larger. The fortress is being evacuated. Aang blinked. Sokka and Mai. They were in there. Sokka and Mai. They're being hunted by my people even as we speak. Long Feng broke in. He laid a hand on Aang's shoulder. My earthbenders are accustomed to combat and danger. Their top priority right now is safely retrieving your friends and getting them out as fast as possible through the last tunnels being kept open. Aang nodded his gratitude. Right, good, but I can help. In evacuating, the Fire Nation's soldiers are clustered on the surface around the fortress. Their defenses still extend far from the sinkhole itself, including the siege weaponry, so if you try to fly your sky bison near them, they'll shoot you out of the sky. And since you are not yet an earthbender, I cannot in good conscience allow you to go underground in this situation. But what about the airbender prisoners? Long Feng offered a smile. The Fire Nation is likely to evacuate such valuable prisoners along with its own people. And if not, I have my men searching for them, too. We are doing everything we can, Avatar. Please, let us work. Besides, it looks like you might be needed here. Long Feng pointed, and Aang turned to see what was going on. Katara was running over, Momo flying behind her, and she was smiling for the first time since the cave-in. Aang. Katara. She didn't slow down enough as she got close to him, and Aang was forced to catch her to keep her from crashing into him. What is it? Is Appa okay? He's fine, but Mother Malu woke up. She wants to see you. It took Aang a moment to realize what she was saying, but as soon as he did, he took off in a run that kicked up a trail of dust. He zoomed straight into the little camp he and the others had set up before their attempt to break into Tian Keng Fortress. They had left Mother Malu in Aang's own tent, and as he burst in, he saw that she was sitting up on her mat and blinking slowly in the dim light. Mother Malu? Are you feeling okay? Avatar, is that you? So you're real, not a dream. Aang nodded. I'm really glad you're up. We tried to heal your mind, but Thank you for the attempt. Being alone for so long in that cursed ashland did not leave me in a healthy state. She smiled. But now I can think clearly. You have saved me, Avatar. Aang could only sigh with relief as Katara and Long Feng came into the tent behind him. And you're really an airbender. By way of answering, Mother Malu raised her hands, brought them together, and pushed outward as she exhaled. A light breeze filled the tent, causing the sides to ripple. It was true. She was an airbender. Aang blinked back tears that threatened to overtake him and smiled. We're trying to save the others right now. We're just outside Tian Keng Fortress, and a team of earthbender rebels are looking to free them. A couple of my friends are in there, too. Mother Malu's face pinched, and she leaned forward. My memories of our meeting they seem unreliable. Did I warn you about the traitor? Aang's stomach sank. You mentioned it, but a noblewoman of the Fire Nation. And, apparently, one of their assassins. Mother Malu looked down, and her fists clenched at her blanket. She came into our abbey as a traveler. A circus performer, of all things. We sheltered her and her companions against the flames, and then later against the ashes. She helped us care for the dead and injured, and even volunteered to stay behind at the abbey when I decided to send some of the girls to retrieve supplies and request help from some old friends of mine. I don't know how, but before that help arrived, the firebenders came and put us in chains. They weren't simply searching the ashes, they knew exactly where to find us and knew that we could airbend. When they broke into the abbey, the traitor addressed them with her formal title, and while we were chained, she was removed from our midst and treated with honor by the soldiers. She had to have betrayed our location to them. Mother Malu let go of the blanket, and reached out to grab Aang's hands, startling him. And she has the gift. She received airbending with the rest of us, after the fires. I worry that she's in that fortress, turning the gift to the Fire Nation's use. Long Feng hissed. A Fire Nation spy from the nobility with the power of airbending. Katara moaned. It's like a sick joke. Aang tried to summon words to add the chorus, but couldn't. He knew the Fire Nation still had goodness in it. Mai was proof enough of that, even though she struggled with it and had trouble finding her way. Yet, to have the power of his people, the art that defined them from the time before time, emerge in one of those helping to take over the world, one of those leading and planning how to crush everyone beneath their boots. Finally, Aang found the words he needed. I'll deal with the traitor. Long Feng, I need to find a way into the fortress. Mother Malu, I need you tell me everything about your abbey and how you got airbending. Please. This is my responsibility, as the Avatar, and the last air nomad. Mother Malu nodded, and at her motion, Aang helped her to her feet, and together they stumbled into the light. Mai couldn't find the strength to move. Her limbs weighed her down and her spine was as stiff as rock. She was like another piece of wreckage at the bottom of the sinkhole, another fallen piece of debris from whatever disaster had befallen Tian Kang Fortress. A part of her mind, the cold analytical part that picked out targets amidst the chaos of battle, noted that her reaction was understandable, given that she had just nearly fallen to her death after essentially fighting a guerrilla war all night. And then there was the matter of her best friend being a secret airbender. Mai blinked, but it was a struggle to lift her eyelids again. How her voice had all the volume of a distant echo, and she had to stop and take a deep breath just to gasp, how could you? It's not my fault, Ty Lee squeaked. I didn't try to become an airbender. And I had nothing to do with the attack on the abbey. Things just keep happening to me. Madajai, standing at the head of her gathered fellow nuns and holding their lone torch above her head, snorted. I don't know if you actually brought your countrymen to our abbey, but you can't deny your responsibility for your own life. You're a noble of your awful nation, living in the capital itself and rubbing elbows with royalty. But what did you ever do about the war? She stepped over to stand towering over Ty Lee. What did you ever do about all the killing your nation has been doing? Your kind wiped out the air nomads, and did you ever care? Did you fight to prevent our being taken? Whether or not you ever tried to hurt anyone, and those fighting skills of yours would be an odd pairing with a pacifist, you're a traitor to the airbending gift you've been given. You'll always shame your bending. You'll always shame us. Ty Lee had been shrinking the whole time Madajai was talking, and by the end, she was crouched on the floor. Mai was now eye level with her oldest friend, but she still couldn't make herself move. Just lifting her hands seemed to be a task akin to holding the whole sky up. Ty Lee looked at her and said, you hate me, too. Mai tried to shake her head and failed. Not really. But Ty Lee's lip quivered. Then why is your aura so black? Mai blinked again, and this time she lacked the strength to keep her eyes open. To the darkness of her own eyelids, she said, because you just made me hate myself. Why yourself? Mai sighed, and managed to open her eyes enough to see Ty Lee's confused face in the torchlight. You thought I'd consider you a monster. You thought you had to hide yourself from me. I know everything about you, but this you wanted to hide. Why? Because Ty Lee's eyes narrowed. We the Fire Nation and the nuns Mai snorted. You thought I'd hate you. After getting you back from the dead, after hugging you, having spent my wild life avoiding physical contact, you thought I'd hate you over this. Aang the Avatar and all his friends already hate me. Now I see what you really think of me. No. Ty Lee grabbed Mai's shoulders and leaned forward until their noses were almost touching. Mai's whole world was filled with Ty Lee's goldish gray eyes. You're my best friend. My only friend. If Angela ever found out, Ty Lee shuddered. Please don't tell Angela. Tell Angela. That had to be the final blow to their friendship. To tell Angela would be to kill Ty Lee. As if Mai would ever do such a thing. but she was too tired to even bother being hurt anymore. She breathed in, letting the cool air fill her lungs, and let the feel of the damp stone against her hands guide her mind. She would be cold, and she would be stone. There would be no fire in her, just the fleeting air. When Mai breathed out again, she was in a state beyond fatigue. A state where the world was just a collection of targets, and the only thing that mattered was hitting the one at the top of the sinkhole with her presence. Come on, let's keep moving. I'd really hate to die in this kind of mood. She pushed Ty Lee away, and only the other girl's complete lack of resistance could have explained why the weak attack actually moved her. Standing alone again, Mai stumbled into the darkness. The airbenders, nuns and runaway acrobats all followed her in silence. Sokka woke up to find that, in addition to his broken rib, he had somehow managed to pick up a skull-splitting headache. He couldn't bring himself to open his eyes, but he could hear whispers that seemed to echo like thunder, crunchy echoes that rang with an unpleasant sharpness, and the grinding of distant machinery that seemed to resonate on the exact frequency required to make his teeth ache. He immediately opened his mouth to complain about this, except his mouth didn't actually open like it was supposed to, and after a moment of panic he realized that a band of smooth stone covered the entire lower half of his face. He had a painful feeling that a headache was the least of his problems. He tried to reach for the covering, but found that his arms wouldn't obey his commands. He seemed to have more stone around each wrist, binding them together in a pair of prisoner's cuffs. When he tried to lift his arms together, he felt a tug around his waist, and realized that he had also been equipped with a stone belt that was somehow attached to the cuffs. It was exactly how he would expect an earthbender to secure a prisoner. Sokka made himself open his eyes into a minimal squint and look around without otherwise moving. It was still dark, but as he peered through the pounding of his head, he saw that there was a dim green glow shading in the shape of rocks and wooden beams and a metal floor. He was lying on that floor yet, it looked and felt like one of the platforms spiraling down the walls of the Fire Nation's sinkhole. So he was still stuck here. Great. Then he saw two pairs of booted feet not far from where he was laying, and the pair of dark robes that hung over them. Despite the jagged feel of his skull, he forced himself to concentrate on the whispers. Have cover up there? You'll have enough, Agent Lao Tao. Just dim your lamp and stick close to the wall, and no one will see you. The last tunnel is stable enough that we can keep it open until you arrive or get spotted. Whichever comes first. Very well, Agent Chuang. Has Long Feng been notified of the captive? He has. He expressed an interest in the possibilities. Ah, good. Then would you care to help me transport said prisoner, Agent Chuang? I'm sorry, Agent Lao Tao, but I have other duties required to make sure that the way is safe for you. You know, fixing ramps, arranging cover for you, spying on the airbenders, that kind of thing. I'm sure you understand. Oh, of course. Agents? Well, at least he had confirmation that he was no longer a prisoner of the Fire Nation. But mysterious agents weren't necessarily an improvement. This Long Feng might make Zhao look like diplomat. Hands covered in stone-hard gloves grabbed Sokka's shirt and hauled him off the floor, making his head throb even worse and the darkened world to spin around him. It was an effort not to vomit, which would have been a disaster in his stone mask, but the morning, by now, was young yet. It still had the potential to get a lot worse. Zhao was out of the hole, but he had a feeling he had left his tattered career back at its bottom. The sky was shifting from the pink of dawn to the grayish blue of a cloudy day. Zhao didn't even have the benefit of a strong sun as he looked over the soldiers who had evacuated from Tiankang Fortress. They were all working, some moving whatever equipment and supplies were recoverable to safe locations, all the rest preparing for combat in case anyone, the Avatar, rebels, or even bandits tried to take advantage of the loss of the sinkhole base. Defensible positions had been constructed out of whatever materials were handy, mostly junk from the fortress, and weapons ranging from the installed siege launchers to personal arms were ready. The outer defenses of the fortress were also all intact, from the outer wall to the massive anti-boulder spikes set into the ground. The whole fleet of tanks was also undamaged and ready to fight. If Zhao had been in proper command, he supposed he might have felt some pride at the efficiency of the recovery. But the fortress wasn't his, it belonged to the regular base commanders who were even now directing things. No, Zhao was here on special assignment, using the fortress as a base for his search for the Avatar and a secure location in which to store his special prisoners. Except now he no longer had any prisoners, and the Avatar's compatriots were responsible for all the damage to the fortress. So Zhao was indirectly responsible for all of the failures and none of the successes. But at least his enemies were still stuck in the sinkhole, and the armored lid that had been deployed at his command over the top was still intact. And Zhao still had direct command of the soldiers provided to him by Prince Iroh. If he managed to recover his losses, Iroh was more than capable of protecting him from the fallout of losing an overexpensive fortress in the middle of nowhere. An aide approached, one of those under Zhao's command. "Sir, what orders?" Zhao motioned to the sprawl of interlocking metal platforms that covered the sinkhole. "The contents of the sinkhole have been left to us. I want my soldiers divided up. One group over there at the exit, one over there where the plates are damaged, and the last here where the crumbling ground has created a gap. If an airbender or a water tribe rebel tries to emerge, it is imperative that they be captured. If a rogue weapon of the Fire Nation shows her face." Zhao considered that possibility. Stumbling across Lady Ty Li amongst the airbenders was one thing, but now she was complicit in destroying the fortress. "I think it's appropriate that they be buried in the sinkhole they're bringing down, don't you?" Without waiting for a response, he started to walk away to see if he could successfully wheedle the use of a tank out of one of the base commanders, but then stopped and turned back to the aide. "And have someone watching the skies. If the Avatar shows up, the other soldiers will try to kill him, but I need him driven away unharmed. We might need to take special action to guarantee the Avatar's continued survival. Those are Prince Admiral Iroh's orders, and if I am forced to disobey them, I will have the hides of the soldiers responsible to present to the prince as recompense." Zhao considered his options as he stalked away. He was becoming far too dependent on Iroh for protection. He needed to complete this odd mission and find a way to win his freedom, preferably without being stabbed by Piandao clanless or executed on the Fire Lord's orders. For now, he needed to be patient, and wait for his enemies to come to him. Mai had half expected to die on her way up to the surface, and was almost disappointed when nobody tried to kill her. The long walk up the sinkhole's ramps had been surprisingly boring. Sure, the whole place shook frequently, with distant crashes of rock slides making the sinkhole's remaining time in this world seem dubious, but there was little Mai could do about that, so she ignored it. There had been enough damage that some of the platforms were hanging by only a single bolt, while others had fallen away completely to leave Mai and the airbenders to climb or jump the gaps, but it was manageable with everyone working together. And if there was one thing airbenders could do, it was jump. Then there was the random debris blocking their way. About 3/4 of the way up the sinkhole, Mai thought she recognized a gas meter from the ground floor of the fortress now lying suspended upside down amidst some collapsed scaffolding. Whatever had exploded after her sabotage of the gas lines had been pretty big. They encountered no living people. There were bodies of soldiers along the path, and the sight of them lying there in the torchlight made Mai realize that if her sabotage was indeed the cause of all the damage, then she was finally responsible for confirmed Fire Nation deaths. She was surprised at her lack of reaction. But then, she had no fire left in her. That they encountered no living people, though, didn't mean that there were none around. At several points, Mai thought she spotted something, distant glows that could have just been the afterimage of Madajai's torch, but maybe were the lanterns of enemies setting up an ambush. And there were sounds, whispers that flitted to Mai's ears beneath the louder noises of the dying sinkhole, which might have been the steps of light feet or the rustle of dark fabrics. Perhaps those sounds were spies or scouts watching for any random escapees who might be making their way up. Or maybe the lights and the sounds were just the ghosts of the people who had died in here. After time beyond Mai's measure, the group reached upper ramps. She had gone first, depending only on the ambient light from the 3 shafts of sunlight stabbing down through the segmented metal ceiling that covered the whole sinkhole. When she was satisfied that the Fire Nation had completely abandoned the area, she motioned for Madajai to lead the others up. When everyone arrived, Mai pointed at one of the gaps in the ceiling. "That looks like the regular exit. It has double doors and some solid stairs leading up to it." Ty Li looked up at it silently, while the nuns chattered. Madajai shushed them and said, "We can go out that way." "Of course not. A whole army is probably sitting up there waiting for us." The same for that one over there at the top of that wall. Mai shifted to point at the last shaft of sunlight, the centermost of the three, which stabbed down right through the center of the sinkhole, far from any platform. There might have been some crane equipment that would have normally occupied that space, but if so it was all gone now. We're going out that one, because no one will expect it. Ty Lee can go first with some rope, and then the rest of us can climb or fly or whatever. It's a shame we have to come out in daylight, but I don't think we can stay here much longer. Ty Lee turned to face her. And we can get away once we're through. Mai actually took a moment to think of the most delicate way to phrase her answer, a task she hoped to never have to repeat. I think it's our best chance. One of the nuns stepped forward with a large coil of rope. I found this. Is it sufficient length? Ty Lee stepped over to check it out, and the nun took a reflexive step back. Mai saw Ty Lee cringe briefly before she forced one of her smiles back on her face and said, "That's fine, Manoa." "Thanks." Madajai took the rope from the nun's Manoa's hands and turned her own glare on Ty Lee. "I will go with you. We will affix the rope together and make sure everyone gets out." Mai resisted the urge groan. "We really don't have time for trust issues right now." Ty Lee was an acrobat even before she got airbending. "You weren't." Madajai stood tall against the criticism. "Maybe not, but I have had the gift of airbending since the war ended, and learned how to use it. I can even fly, on a windy day with the use of a small sail. I can certainly climb well enough to reach that gap." Mai had no energy left for arguing. She looked at Ty Lee, who just shrugged. With a sigh, Mai said, "Whatever. Just be careful not to stick your head through the hole until we're all ready to make a break for it." Madajai nodded as if it was worthwhile advice and lifted the coil of rope over her head so that it hung on her like a sash. Then she jumped up to grab onto some of the wrecked scaffolding above, her leap leaving behind winds that whipped Mai's hair free of its bun. Mai sighed again as she tilted her head and reached to retie it, but the new angle of her vision gave her a view of some of the spiraling ramps several levels below, and she thought she saw another of those ghost lights making its way slowly across the structure. Or was it just a trick of the eyes? Imagination born of exhaustion. Mai was tired and didn't want to investigate strange lights, but the situation was too dangerous. A single attacker who struck while everyone was climbing the rope could kill them all. And as tired as Mai was, she wasn't about to let the new Air Nation die through her own laziness. Mai looked up to see Ty Lee and Madajai still climbing up to the ceiling, where they could use the seams and hinges between each plate to go hand over hand to the gap. They seemed to be making good but slow progress. Satisfied, she turned to the nun who had found the rope originally. "What was her name?" "Ah, that's right. Hey, Manoa. I'm going to check something out. Get everyone started on climbing the rope if it's set up before I get back." "What are you dash?" But Mai didn't have time if she was going to do this. She walked off before Manoa could finish her question, trying to move as fast as she could but not even managing a weak jog. Whatever Mai found, she hoped it didn't require a fight. It was surprisingly hard to track the ghost glow. The sunlight breaking in through the ceiling wasn't enough to actually illuminate much, but it did provide enough ambient light to keep the glow from standing out much against the darkness. Mai wasn't even sure if the light was moving anymore. She seemed to be drawing closer to it as she moved down the spiraling ramp, and she couldn't figure out if that was a good sign or not. She reached behind herself to draw her sword, her last weapon, from its sheath, and tried to step delicately as she made her final approach on the light. Pebbles crunched under her feet as she moved into the glow of a crystal lantern and found Sokka lying propped against the wall, his arms bound by black cuffs and some kind of mask over the lower half of his face. His squinting, unfocused eyes converged on her, and she realized she had walked into a trap. Mai had time for one action, either turn around to meet her attacker or attempt to free Sokka. In the end, it wasn't a choice at all. She swung her sword at Sokka's cuffs even as something hard crashed into the back of her neck. Her arms stopped working and the handle of the sword spilled out of her grip just when the blade struck at the cuffs, making it bounce off harmlessly. She had chosen and failed. Mai fell to the ground, her body finally giving out. Her limbs were dead stone. Darkness claimed her. But then, she had known all along it would. Ty Lee would have to seek the daylight for herself, now. Ty Lee's world was upside down. That was one of those metaphor things with a double meaning. Ty Lee was hanging from the metal-plated lid of the sinkhole, her feet tucked into the seams between two of the plates while she held onto one of the hinges connecting another two with her left hand. Her right hand was putting the finishing touches on knotting the rope Sister Matagi had carried up here. Ty Lee was hanging like a tiger monkey, looking up, with the whole sinkhole below her, and the damaged hole in the ceiling glowing impossibly bright an arm's length away from her. Escape was just a short jump away, once everyone else was ready. That was the literal part, since she was all upside down, physically. The metaphor part was that everything else was wrong, upended, backwards. The worst was that Mai hated Ty Lee, now. Mai hated her. Ty Lee's best friend hated her. Ty Lee's aura was a horrible, muddy green over that alone, and then there was the way all the nuns Ty Lee's newest former friends hated her, too. She had turned from a regular person into some kind of magic windy nomad because of spirity stuff she just didn't understand, and of course the whole Fire Nation would hate her for it. Zhao had taken her captive and locked her in a tower, like a princess from one of those storybooks that had always made Angela laugh. The Air Nation had been the Fire Nation's enemies, a long time ago, and there were entire books filled with the awful things the Airbenders had done in the early days of the war. Sure, there were probably nice airbenders, and the nuns from Mother Malu's abbey had all been wonderful and helped save Ty Lee from the fires, but there was still all that history about evil nomads stealing babies from cradles and sending storms down on beach settlements and generally keeping the Fire Nation from sharing its culture in a peaceful way. The Air Nation had forced this war into existence. History said they were monsters. That made Ty Lee a monster, too. If anyone back home knew she could airbend, they'd hate her. They'd hurt her. They'd kill her. And Angela would. Ty Lee had to stop thinking about it, in case she shivered too hard and fell from her perch. Angela liked to control things, and she hadn't given Ty Lee permission to become an airbender. Just thinking about that made her sorry for whatever she had done to take command of the winds. But Ty Lee could almost think she deserved the whole situation. She had assumed the worst of Mai, a horrible insult. The worst insult. Mai was everyone's unfavorite, but Ty Lee had always stuck with her. Sometimes, Ty Lee had been the only one. By not telling Mai about the airbending, she had insulted the trust between them. Mai was right to hate her for it. Just like the other new airbenders hated Ty Lee, because of the fires that had killed so many, even some of her friends from the circus. The Fire Nation had done that, had killed its own people. They were monsters, too. Everyone was all monsters. Ty Lee's life was upside down, and it was very lonely. She finished the knot and looked over to where Sister Matagi was hanging. All done. You can go get the others now. Sister Matagi nodded, still looking all stern with her aura an ugly, angry red. She looped one of her long sleeves over the rope, and used a gust of wind to send herself sliding down the line to other nuns. So Ty Lee was left upside down and alone. Literally and metaphorically. Boo. She watched as Sister Matagi got all the sisters organized, and watched as Manoa was the first one to start climbing up the rope. She looked around to make sure Mai was at the back of the group, ready to escape with everyone, but couldn't spot anyone not wearing abbey robes. That was weird. Where could? Ty Lee swung her head from side to side, looking around the sinkhole for her friend. Ex-friend. Hopefully soon ex-friend. Not that Ty Lee deserved it. She couldn't spot Mai anywhere. Not on the ramps, not on the scaffolding, not dangling from a platform somewhere, not swinging from the ceiling or anything silly like that. All she could see were the nuns starting their climb to freedom, and some soldiers coming down that double-doored entrance in the ceiling. Wait, soldiers? Ty Lee immediately turned back to the nuns and called, "The fire army is here. You have to hurry." Then she let go of the hinges and allowed her body to swing from where her feet were still wedged into the seams of the ceiling until she was bent back in the other direction and grabbed the next set of hinges while she pulled her feet free and let her swing continue on, hands to feet to hands to feet to hands to feet to letting go completely and crossing the whole sinkhole in a spin to fall on the soldiers with her fists ready. They tried to fight her, going wild with their fire and swords and spears and whatever, but they were just so inflexible. Once they were moving forward, they could only keep going until they came to a stop, but Tai Li knew how to twist and swerve and bend and make her motion turn around like a twirling top. It was similar to how the air could shift in an instant, all that wind that filled the whole world around her suddenly changing directions and blowing the other way just because it wanted to. So Tai Li moved all around them like a storm. She could see their auras shift through colors and emotions, giving away the moments when resolve became anger, became fear, became loyalty, became selfishness, became acceptance, became pain, telegraphing what they were about to do. She knew the human body and all its intricacies, and on each soldier she targeted a convenient chi meridian, a place where the flows of energy that made up life itself converged and pooled, driving her fists into one unarmored spot on each enemy to turn their bodies against them. They found themselves dropping their awful weapons, losing their fire, and becoming trapped in unresponsive bodies. They looked at her with fear, looks that thrilled a little part of her that she tried to keep under control because it wasn't a nice part even before she swung her arms and blew them all back up through the ceiling door with a burst of the wind that had taken so much from her. Except more soldiers were coming down the stairs through that door, and they caught their friends and threw them aside as they all rushed at Tai Li with more fire and swords and spears and junk. Her heart sank. The escape was ruined. The fire army outside knew what she and the nuns were trying to do. And Mai was missing. Tai Li threw herself at the soldiers and put her fists to work, that little part of her resolving to make sure that the pain she felt in her heart was shared amongst the people who had inflicted it. Only so many soldiers could fit on this portion of this ramp with her, and the ceiling kept any more from attacking from above. She could beat them all, maybe. It was the only way. Over the grunts and groans and cries of pain, Tai Li heard Sister Matagi scream, and turned to see the rope they had tied was now on fire. The nuns were falling and gliding back to a lower platform, and more soldiers were climbing down through a gap between the rim of the sinkhole and the ceiling, the one Mai had said was probably being watched. Oh, no. They were trapped, and no one was coming to save them. As the clouds swirled around them, Aang patted the stone helmet covering Appa's head. You doing okay, buddy? It's not too heavy, is it? Appa let out a confident bellow, but Aang could hear the straining beneath it. Appa wouldn't be able to fly all day like this, not with the stone armor covering almost every bit of his fur, stone armor that had been shaped and compressed by Long Feng and his earthbenders to be as solid as possible. Hopefully, he'd be okay long enough for their daring rescue. On that point, Aang turned to where Long Feng was sitting in the saddle with Katara, Mother Malu, Momo. Are you sure this is going to work? Long Feng had been looking a little green since Appa had taken off, but otherwise he looked calm as he nodded. It will take precision and a little luck, but I trust my agent's information. With their data about the current state of fortress interior, and your Sky Bison's ability to fly over most of the defenses, we have a chance of saving your friends. Aang hoped so. He tugged the reins, giving Appa the signal to start, and began a breathing exercise that calmed his body and summoned a special kind of clarity. The monks back at the Southern Air Temple had used this technique to speed up their perception, to call upon the tranquility of the sky and see the world around them as if it were in slow motion. It was a necessary technique for surviving a freefall. Appa gave an excited groan, tensed his body, and then twisted and flapped his tail to send himself into a shooting power dive. The air battered at Aang like a hurricane, but this was no wind. Appa was just falling so fast that the still air of the early morning felt like a wrathful storm. Aang held tightly onto the reins as wisps of cloud whipped past him. Soon enough, the clouds parted and the sprawl of the surface side of Tian Keng Fortress was revealed in front of him, or rather, below him, but Appa was diving so fast that the pull of gravity was completely lost. Most importantly, Aang saw that they were still on course. The lid over the sinkhole was directly ahead. Aang turned briefly to check on everyone in the saddle. Katara was squinting against the wind and holding her borrowed hat down on her head. Mother Malu was holding Momo tightly against her chest, and the lemur seemed to be watching everything with wide, excited eyes. Long Feng looked like he was screaming, or at least trying to, but Appa was falling so fast that all sounds were completely lost in the rushing of the air past them. Everyone seemed to be as well as they could be. When Aang turned back, he found that the fortress and the ground were a lot closer than they had been a moment ago. He could also see movement below, some small dots that seemed to be moving and growing. No, wait, they weren't growing. The dots were flying up to meet them. The first of the dots resolved itself into a massive ballista bolt that was upon them before Aang could even blink and smacked into Appa's left side, right between the saddle and his legs. Appa moaned, and they flew wildly off course, but the bolt bounced off the stone armor and spun away in the air. Aang glanced back again, and already saw Long Feng leaning over the saddle, smoothing the dent in the stone armor and melting the cracks back into solid stone. More bolts, and even flaming stones, came up to try to knock them all out of the sky. Aang steered them back so that they were once again headed for the sinkhole's cover, and then tried to guide Appa in some quick dodges that wouldn't take them far. Some of the projectiles hit them anyway, striking against the stone armor and bouncing off just as the first ballista bolt had. Aang had to trust that Long Feng could keep up with repairing the damage, because he needed his entire attention on what was ahead, now. As Appa weathered the attack, the ground got closer and closer and closer. Aang could now see individual people and tanks moving around on the surface as he guided Appa to the particular part of the sinkhole's cover. The people below were trying to adjust the siege weaponry, but it was too late. There was no way they could reorient the machinery fast enough to track Appa's fall. The tanks launched streams of fire in one last attack, but Aang was ready, letting go of the reins and flinging out an arc of wind that blew the flames back just long enough to escape them. Then Aang kicked his boots down on Appa's helmet. That was signal for the next phase of the plan. The sinkhole lid was almost filling Aang's vision, now. Appa responded immediately, curling in the air to aim his tail forward and flapping it with all his bison strength. The rushing winds grew stronger for a moment as Appa pushed back against the ground, then the air calmed as their fall started to slow. Right on time, Long Feng lunged forward right beside Aang, punching both of his fists in front of him and giving a roar of exertion that was audible even over the screaming of the wind. Aang grabbed Long Feng and gave a little hop as the helmet beneath them and all of Appa's stone armor detached and shot forward like pebbles out of a slingshot. All those hard, dense, solid stone pieces impacted with the sinkhole's metal lid, and they did so with all the speed of Appa's powered dive, enhanced by the pull of gravity, and backed up by the full power of Long Feng's earthbending. Normally, even that much stone would have just bounced off the metal armor that the Fire Nation used on all its creations. But backed up by this kind of speed? This kind of force? The stones tore through the metal like it was made of paper. Of course, Appa was still going pretty fast, too. Fast enough that if the cover was still there, they would have all been crushed to death on impact. Aang grabbed the reins again and pulled with all his might, conveying the urgency of the situation to Appa. The big guy was flapping his tail towards the ground as fast and as hard as he could, continuing to bleed off speed but not before they had plunged straight into the sinkhole. According to Long Feng, his agents had verified that all the damage the fortress had suffered had left the center of the sinkhole clear of most of its machinery. According to the plan, Aang and Appa would have plenty of room to decelerate enough to turn their dive back into a climb out of the sinkhole. Aang hoped it was true. Appa roared as he fell further into the sinkhole, but Aang could make out individual platforms and ramps as they passed by, and the air no longer sounded like a hurricane. He felt himself growing heavier, and heard everyone back in the saddle cry out as they crashed together into the front of the saddle. With one last mighty cry, Appa arched his back and swooped up, rising out the darkness of the wrecked fortress to the top levels where a battle was already in progress. Or actually, it looked like two battles on opposite sides of the sinkhole. Aang wasn't sure what was going on with the battle on his left, because all he could see over there were Fire Nation soldiers clustering together around something, but the one on the right was much clearer. He could see soldiers surrounding a group of women in robes of white and gold cut similarly to what Mother Malu was wearing. The airbenders. Aang steered in that direction, but even as he brought Appa into a hover beside the platform, men in the robes and hats of Long Feng's agents were rushing out of the shadows of the lower platforms to spring up in earthbending-assisted jumps to join the fight. Long Feng himself hopped out of the saddle to take command, leaving Aang free to get the nuns' attention by taking a stance on Appa's head and swirling the air around them. Their eyes all followed the movement of the breeze as it twirled and rose back up to him. When he was sure they had spotted him, Aang smiled, waved, and called out, "I'm the Avatar, and I'm here to save you. When it's clear, everyone get aboard the Sky Bison and we'll fly out of here." The nuns' cheers rose out over the sounds of the earthbenders taking down the soldiers. With that settled, Aang looked around for Sokka or Mai. He couldn't see them anywhere around the nuns, and got a sinking feeling when he remembered the battle on the other side of the sinkhole. He turned to see if they might be over there, worried that it was too late and they had been overwhelmed. Instead, he saw that the soldiers on that far platform were all sprawled as though unconscious, while a lone woman in pink was standing and staring back at him. "The traitor," Mother Malu called out. "It's her." The woman in pink startled, and turned to run away. No, Aang wouldn't allow that. This woman had gotten his new nation captured, and was probably responsible for Mai and Sokka not being here. He wouldn't let her escape. He jumped off of Appa's head and over the vastness of the sinkhole, using a wind to guide him to the hanging debris from the wrecked ceiling. He touched down on some of the twisted metal only long enough to jump up into a wind again, covering the rest of the distance over to the woman in pink. He landed in front of her and took an attack stance. "You're not getting away with any of this." She snapped into her own stance with fists held high, and they dashed towards each other at the exact same time. The woman threw punches at Aang even as he twisted and tried to blast her with air generated by palm strikes, but she rolled with the winds and rode them to gain some distance. Further apart than before, they stopped and stared each other down. Then the woman turned and jumped off the platform, leaping higher and farther than any normal person should have, and at the apex she seemed to get another boost that carried her to same hanging metal debris that Aang had used to cross the gap. So she had figured out airbending. She was an airbender for the Fire Nation. Aang leaped after her, resolved to make sure the woman in pink answered for her crimes, one way or another. Chapter 34, Raise Up the New. Zhao blinked. He had just seen an armored sky bison smash straight down through the metal shutter covering the sinkhole and somehow survive the process. Silence descended upon the soldiers around him, and he could see that all movement had stopped on the other side of the sinkhole. Tian Keng Fortress's surface-level defenses were designed to repel attackers coming from around or above the sinkhole. They had nothing up here on the surface that could now be aimed into the sinkhole's interior, where the Avatar and who know how many allies were free to collect the captured airbenders and anyone else still down there. That brought Zhao out of his shock. He could not lose those prisoners. "Get in there," he shouted to his soldiers, "and keep those airbenders underground." As they moved out, Zhao hung back and watched to see what the rest of fortress defenders were going to do. He commanded the specific marines detached by Prince Admiral Iroh for this special mission, but all the other soldiers in the fortress were free to follow other orders. They had no reason to keep the Avatar alive. Zhao, on the hand, did even if he only had his suspicions as to why Iroh wanted the Avatar to remain an active threat. He grabbed one of the colonels before she could run off and hissed, "Remember our orders. If we have to attack our countrymen in order to follow those orders, then we cannot hesitate. Do you understand?" The colonel's eyes went wide only for a moment, and then she got control of herself and nodded. Zhao let her go and looked to see if there was a tank nearby he could commandeer. Until it came to the point where he had to order an attack on the fire army, he intended to help pour fire down into that sinkhole. And if it did come to an attack, his soldiers knew what to do. There was no reason for him to stick around and deal with the consequences. Fire and spears and arrows and chains all rained down into the sinkhole, but Ty Lee only had eyes for her pursuer, the bald boy in saffron clothes with the big blue arrow on his head. He scowled as he flew through the air towards her, carried by winds that responded to him like music under the command of a conductor. He was a true airbender. The Avatar. And he apparently wanted to smack Ty Lee silly. She had tried to run, but he had followed. She had jumped out to the twisted, hanging wreckage of the ceiling that used to cover the sinkhole, the edges of it still clinging to the rock but the center having been ripped open by a swooping sky bison, but he had leapt after her. He would not be denied. He had crashed into an underground fortress in order to reach his fellow airbenders, and now he was putting his house in order. Mother Malu had called Ty Lee a traitor, and the Avatar had responded like an attack dog. Mai had said that she was working for him against the Fire Nation, and as much as Ty Lee loved her, Mai was not a nice person. So what did the Avatar employ her to do? Mai had said she was having a rough year. Her normal fastidiousness had been worn away by experiences that had turned her aura black, and there had been no flashes of happier colors when she mentioned her allies. The Avatar might be Ty Lee's only chance to find a new home now that she had been gifted, cursed, with airbending, but so far he did not seem like a very nice person, either. She hoped she could stop him without hurting him too much. She hoped she could stop him at all. The avatar landed on the same wide metal slat as Tai Li, and he had barely touched one foot down before he kicked out to the side with the other and flicked a steel pole into the air in front of him. As the second foot touched down, he grabbed the pole with both hands and spun it like a staff into a guard position, all without fully stopping. He shifted into a light run that barely disturbed the slat beneath his feet, charging at Tai Li and readying his makeshift staff for a strike. She raised her arms and squeezed her hands into fists. She was a weapon of the Fire Nation, and would prove it again today. Tai Li let the avatar strike first, waiting for him to swing one end of the staff into a quick strike at her feet. She hopped over that, and as expected found he following that up with another attack, a thrust with the other end at her center line that she curled around before throwing herself into a butterfly twirl over the pole that got her clear of it. The avatar followed without hesitation, spinning the staff in front of him before directing it into a strike at her head from the right. It moved with enough speed that she knew attempting to block with any part of her body would result in broken bone, so instead she shifted her weight and slumped so that she was no longer in the staff's direct path. As it passed over her with an ear-splitting whistle, she smacked at its underside with her right forearm to send it arcing wildly upward. She took the opportunity to throw a left punch in at the center line of the avatar's chest and set up for a right, but he kept control of his weapon and used the momentum of the part that had missed her to bring the other end around to smack both punches off course with quick swipes. Tai Li whirled away even as the avatar did the same, and they orbited each other for a brief moment. She tried to shove in with her left shoulder, but he leaned back and lifted his right leg high enough to catch her, and then kicked out like a coiled spring to send her sailing up into the air. But Tai Li was at home in the air. Maybe not as much as him, but it was still her friend. She tucked into a ball with enough force to spin herself around, and when she struck another hanging slat, it was with flat feet and tucked legs, and she jumped off with her own spring-like power, shooting back at the avatar. He had come to a stop by then and yelped at her sudden return before lifting his staff horizontally above his head in a last-ditch defense. She could work with that. She reached out as she came down on him and grabbed the staff with both her hands, and then swung her legs up to spin her around like she was on a trapeze bar. She spun around the staff until she landed standing back to back with the avatar, and then yanked with all her strength to lift him up and throw him over her head. He cried out and fell down into the wide empty center of the sinkhole, still holding his stick. Tai Li jumped right in after him. Part of her wondered what she was doing, continuing the offensive like this, but she told that part to be quiet and go sit in the corner. She had to show her strength, if she was going to avoid persecution without end. It was what she had learned from a lifetime of being hated for seeking uniqueness. Unless people knew you would hit back, they wouldn't hesitate to beat you into submission or death, whichever came first. That's what the Fire Nation had done to the Air Nation, a century ago. No doubt that was what the Air Nation had wanted to do to the Fire Nation first. The avatar slowed his own fall with his air bending, the winds making his orange shawl snap and flutter like it was a crazed animal trying to escape. Tai Li swung her arms forward to summon her own wind, a new skill she had taught herself since becoming a bender, speeding herself towards her opponent. She crashed into him hard enough to make them both gasp, but she grabbed onto his staff with one hand and pulled herself close enough to throw a punch with the other. When her fist connected with his body, she realized she had made a mistake. She missed the chi point she had been aiming at. He threw a backhand at her head, but he encountered the same problem she had. Tumbling like this, buffeted by the air and twisting around the staff, they were moving too much to fight with any precision. So they proceeded to fight with no precision at all. Punches and kicks and smacks and shoves and pokes and chops and elbows were exchanged in a flurry, a dozen blows going back and forth in the space of a second. They fought a whole war in the time it took them to fall 3 stories and land on one of the wide ramps bolted to the side of the sinkhole. They both lost their grip on the staff with the first impact and went skipping in separate directions as the staff clattered away on its own trip. Tai Li managed to turn her motion into a roll and came to a stop in a crouching defensive stance, but her brain hadn't caught up with the rest of her body, and when she opened her eyes the world was still spinning. She shook her head, trying to make the dizzy go away and come back another day, but instead she became conscious of waves of pain sweeping in with the languid fury of the tides as her body complained about everything she had just put it through. Jumping after enemies she had thrown down a sinkhole was a bad idea. Tai Li shook her head again and the world finally stopped doing loop-a-loops around her. Her eyes focused again and she saw that the avatar was getting to his feet a short distance away. She sprang into a leap that would cover that distance, and threw another set of punches even as she landed right in front of him. He cried out with an "Hoo-oh-ay-ay-ay-ay" as he stumbled backwards, but she followed, keeping up her attack. He jerked and twitched as he stumbled, his eyes locked on her fists the whole time, and then he clapped his hands together to produce an explosion of air. The gust was strong enough to knock Tai Li back, and she couldn't help but give a "Yah" as she went flying to land on her butt. As she got to her feet and rubbed the sore spot, she resolved to figure out how to do that one. Then she heard a rapid movement of air, almost like the propeller of a large ventilation unit, and looked up to see the avatar riding a spinning ball of dusty wind straight at her. She leaped high enough to reach the next ramp above her, grabbed the edge, swung herself up to curl so that her feet were propped up against the ramp's thick side, and then jumped out across the sinkhole again. If he had to ride around the whole edge of the gap to get to her, she'd have time to figure out how to deal with his approach. Instead, pushing herself over the vast space with the wind summoned by her outstretched arms, she looked down and saw that the avatar's little scooter thing was carrying him around fast enough to get to the other side ahead of her. Tai Li bit her lip and clenched her fists. She couldn't change her course now. The avatar reached the other side, executed a quick turn on his airball, and rode it into a leap that would take him up and out to meet her in midair. Katara was in a hole in the ground, in a pit where the Fire Nation had built another of its engines of destruction, a dark place where a new nation had been locked away to wither. She felt like she had come home. She could leave her borrowed hat back in Appa's saddle as she leaped out to join the battle, and ignore the glimpse of the sky visible through the torn metal ceiling. It was a bright but distant thing that could have been a painting on a solid ceiling for all it mattered right now. The Airbender nuns had been surrounded by Fire Nation soldiers when she had joined Longfang's Earthbenders in battle. Katara's waterskins were full of the same water that had nearly collapsed a cave on top of her, and she unleashed it in defense of the nuns before she even landed. She focused on protecting the women, dousing any fireballs flying in their direction and flinging icicles to block more solid weapons, while the Earthbenders took on the Fire Army directly. After all, they didn't need to conserve their element, they were surrounded by it. Katara had used to watch the Earthbenders in Haru's village, had seen how they moved and sparred. What Longfang's followers did was similar in certain ways, but very different in how it looked. In place of the grand, powerful movements were quicker, snapping gestures. Instead of boulders, these Earthbenders threw fist-sized stones. When it came to a choice between defense and offense, they went on the attack every time. It wasn't until all the enemies within the sinkhole were defeated that Katara realized what their fighting style reminded her of the Fire Army itself. They fought like firebenders. But they were bending earth, and wearing green. That was what was important, what allowed Katara to differentiate in the chaos of battle. Then that part of the fighting was over, all enemies were down, and it was time to prepare for an escape. Too bad there were more firebenders outside the sinkhole throwing fire down through the tear in the ceiling. Katara ran over to the nuns, now clustered together against the wall, and waved her hands. "Hey, we need to get out of here. Everyone onto the Sky Bison." That caught their attention. She heard chattering, and even a gasp of, "It is a Sky Bison." Some of the Earthbenders pulled protective walls out of the sides of the sinkhole while others threw rocks back up at the Fire Army, and Longfang was directing them to form a continuous cover over to where Appa waited. Katara turned back to the Airbenders. "This isn't going to be easy. Appa the Sky Bison can't carry too much weight, and there's only so much room in the saddle. But we have rope waiting, so we need you to use it to anchor yourselves to the holes in the saddle's side, and when we take off, you'll have to use your airbending to make yourselves lighter. Can you all do that?" The nuns made sounds of affirmation, and one of them stepped forward. "We can. I am Sister Matagi. You are with the Avatar." Katara nodded. "And we have Mother Malu in the saddle waiting for you. Now, you all need to move dash." I saw the Avatar chase Tai Li into the depths of the sinkhole. He needs to be stopped. Tai Li is not a friend, but neither is she an enemy right now. But Katara looked at the nuns, and they were all nodding. But Mother Malu said she was the traitor, the one who Sister Madajai cut Katara off with a wave of her hand. I have no time for this. If you will not stop the fight, I will do so. Sisters, follow the waterbender. Then she jumped, a leap that no normal person ever could have managed, sailing up and then swooping down the center of the sinkhole. Katara tried to call out after her, but then shook her head. There was nothing she could do now. Aang would have to handle it. She grabbed the nearest nun and guided the older woman behind the cover that the earthbenders were maintaining, moving towards Appa, but then the platform beneath her shook, and one of the large stone walls ahead crumbled, allowing a fireball to arc through the defenses and splash down on the platform. The fire had not yet gone out before the platform began tilting. The sinkhole's structure is collapsing, Long Feng shouted. We have to leave now. Katara nodded, threw her water forward to form a wall of ice that would continue to protect the escaping airbenders, and hurried them all along. She had no sooner reached Appa with the first wave of escapees when one whole side of the sinkhole, a shard the size of a palace, broke off and fell into the darkness. Aang had never actually fought an airbender before. Sure, he had sparred against his fellow monks, and got into arguments with the other kids. He had even participated in a formal debate as part of a visit to the Northern Air Temple, something that had turned a boring lesson about some controversial bit of bison herding history into a fun event. But now he was locked in a brawl with the airbender Traitor girl, and he wasn't sure he was going to win. She was definitely a novice when it came to airbending. Her fighting style was already heavily focused on dodging and jumping, but it lacked the fundamental circularity of the monk's Bagwazang style. Yet she was still defending against all of Aang's attacks, and her punches moved with such speed and force that they made the air snap. She had an attack drive completely unlike anything he had encountered when sparring with his friends, and also a capacity for movement and retreat that no firebender ever could have managed. That's why he was trying to keep her up in the air. Having cut off her latest jumping retreat with the speed of his air scooter, Aang was now leaping up to meet her in the center of the sinkhole. He coiled his right leg, and waited until they passed each other to snap out a kick that struck with a burst of air bending. The traitor used her own bending to spin herself in midair, taking the kick with a forearm block that transformed the force of the blow into more spinning, and even used the air-bending strike that came with it to gain some height on her leap. And then Aang was sailing past her, landing on the opposite side of the sinkhole. He was as far from victory as he was from the traitor. And he still didn't know what she had done to Mai and Sokka. Aang was about to summon another air scooter when everything around him shook and groaned, and the platform beneath his feet fell along with the whole wall it was attached to. He was barely able to jump in time, instinct driving him into the center of the sinkhole again. And of course he found the traitor already in the middle of her own jump in pursuit of him, the surprised expression on her face revealing that she had not been expecting to see him returning to meet her for another joust, never mind find herself now heading towards a disaster area in the making instead of a safe landing. Even so, she punched out again as Aang passed her, but he puffed out his cheeks and blew down with a burst of airbending that popped him up and over her. As soon as Aang landed on the sinkhole's far side, he turned and watched to see if the traitor would survive. He hoped she did. He hated her, but he didn't want another airbender to die ever again. And his eyes went wide as the traitor did indeed land on a platform just before it fell away with its supporting piece of wall. But she leaped straight up to another falling platform and then jumped again to a piece of falling stone, and she was running and jumping up a collapsing wall. Aang summoned an air scooter and hopped on. He aimed it straight at the closest stable wall, pumping enough speed into his travel so that instead of crashing, a quick shift of weight was enough to race straight up the wall. Gravity pulled at him, slowing him, so he eased into that pull and let it guide his air scooter into a spiral up the walls of the sinkhole, curving his path back towards the traitor and the collapsing stone while maintaining enough speed to keep from falling. He wasn't sure what he was trying to accomplish, whether he was going to save her or attack her, but he just knew that he needed to get close. And even though she was busy running up a series of falling rocks no bigger than her head, feet barely touching each one before pushing off with just enough power to kick the stone downward even faster and propel herself to the next one in line, she had enough spare attention and energy to grab for Aang as soon as he reached her, clinging to him and pressing herself against his back as he sped on his way. Whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't that. Panic seized him at finding her on top of him and wrapping her arms around his neck, and he twisted to try to get out of her grasp, unbalancing him atop his scooter and falling prey to that annoying gravity again so that he fell into his own tornado ball. Aang endured a chaotic moment of being spun and tumbled along with the traitor until he had no sense of direction whatsoever, and then the ball of wind collapsed and spat him out with speeds not unlike Apis sneezes. He liked to think it was his skill that made sure he wound up flying upward, but he wasn't that good at lying. He and the traitor crashed together through wrecked scaffolding and support structures, and he knew they'd find no safety here. Push against the wall, he growled, and threw his hands in that direction to unleash all the airbending power he could muster. Something about that reached the traitor clinging to him, and she let go off his neck with one arm and threw her own palm strike at the crumbling wall at the same time to let loose with a burst of wind. And so they shot themselves out into open space, to the other side of the sinkhole, and crashed together on a stable platform. Aang and the traitor girl hugged each other before shoving apart and attacking again. The traitor tried to hit him with a left arrow fist, but this time Aang was ready for it, taking a half step that moved him out of the way just enough but still keeping him close enough so that he could wrap his right arm around her extended limb and trap it. She tried to use her free fist to punch at his right shoulder, but Aang slapped up with his own free hand to knock the attack out of the way. And that's when the traitor swept at his feet with her left leg, hooking him and twisting him off balance so that he lost his grip on her and they both crashed to the floor. As they were getting to their feet again, a woman in torn robes of white and gold so like those of Mother Malu appeared between them from above, her landing softened by winds that Aang knew all too well. He and the traitor both looked to the new arrival. And then the nun raised both of her arms to poke Aang and the traitor hard right on their foreheads. Aang plopped right back down the floor, and he heard the traitor do the same. "Ow," he grunted. "Why did you do that?" The nun looked down without a trace of sympathy. "I am Sister Madigi, helper to Mother Malu, and both of you are acting like cranky children. You are not enemies. The Avatar is the guardian of balance, and Ty Lee is many things but no ally to the Fire Nation right now. You two will stop fighting this instant or so help me I will leave you in this sinkhole." Aang blinked. But Mother Malu said dash. Sister Madigi poked his head again. "Ty Lee is like family to your friend Mai. She would do nothing to hurt her." Then she turned to the trait to Ty Lee and delivered another forehead poke. "And you try talking things out before jumping into a fight." Aang rubbed his forehead. For the first time in a long time, everything was making sense. Being yelled at by a strict nun was a sign that all was finally right in the world. The guilty feeling in his chest over the enormity of his mistake was all too familiar, as well. Ty Lee rubbed her forehead and bowed as well as she could while sprawled on the floor in a show of remorse and obedience. "I'm sorry, Sister Madigi. I guess I panicked." The nun nodded with only the slightest trace of satisfaction. "Good. Now, we must leave. The sinkhole is collapsing, and the others should be ready to flee now." "What?" the Avatar said as he stood up, "about Mai and Sokka? I haven't seen them, and I thought we need to take them with us." Sister Madigi shook her head. "Your friend Mai went to investigate something before the Fire Nation attacked us again. I have not seen her since. I know nothing of this Sokka but dash." Ty Lee was up on her feet in an instant. "He got captured. He pushed me and Mai off a roof and told us to free the airbenders and then Zhao's soldiers got him. I hope dash." She shook her head, needing more than hope right now. "He had to have been taken along when the fire army evacuated the sinkhole." She looked over to the Avatar, and found his big eyes welling with tears. "I'm sorry. He didn't give us choice, and I don't know where he could be now. Him or Mai." Ty Lee felt her own eyes starting to water. After the insult she had given Mai by not trusting her, now she had let her friend be captured by the Fire Nation, too. Sister Madigi's finger jammed into Ty Lee's forehead again. "No crying. We have to leave, and you can rescue your friends another day." She grabbed Ty Lee's arm with one hand and the Avatar's with the other, and leaped. With no choice now, Ty Lee kicked downward to create her own airbending lift, and she could feel the Avatar doing something even more complicated with motions of his free arm that swirled the air and formed a rising tornado. The three of them sped up through the sinkhole, getting closer to the sunlight spearing down through the wrecked ceiling to reveal the war that was being fought at the top levels. Fire and rock filled the air as Sister Madigi guided their landing to one particular platform where the biggest fuzzy thing Ty Lee had ever seen waited. Easily twice the size of a fire army tank, It roared when it saw them with a volume that shook loose more of the sinkhole walls, and Ty Lee was ready to yank her arm free and run away again. Except the avatar broke free first, and he ran towards the animal, throwing his arms wide and giving a hug to the creature's massive nose. Oh! This must be the sky bison. Ty Lee instantly wanted to hug it, too. But Sister Matagi shoved her, saying, "Get aboard," and Ty Lee remembered that there was no time. She ran to the creature and flipped up to its back, where the other nuns were clustered. They were in some kind of a boat-like saddle, most of them pressed as close together as newborn camel puppies, but some hanging off the saddle's sides and even clutching the bison's tail. Ty Lee had no sooner landed on one of the bison's 6 shoulders than a nun little Ada was tying a rope around her waist. Then the avatar said something that sounded like, "Yip, yip," and a girl's voice shouted, "Everyone airbend with all you have." And then they flew. The sky bison rose up out of the sinkhole, riding the winds being generated by all the nuns the way a manatee lion glides through the ocean depths. Fire and arrows zoomed past them, and Ty Lee could feel the heat of their passage, but the bison's powerful muscles kept it undulating through the air currents with power like a machine press, and the winds being created by all the nuns worked together to sweep most of the attacks off target. Inspired, Ty Lee brought her own hands up, clenched them into her signature arrow fists, one knuckle in the center of each extended for precise application of force, and began shadow boxing at the incoming flames and arrows. Though her fists struck nothing but empty air, that air responded to her, jabbing out in mimicry of her punches to snap arrows in half and puncture fireballs. The flight seemed to go on forever, and it might have been the greatest experience of Ty Lee's life. It was like her performances in the circus on the tightropes, except there was no rope, and instead of being by herself above everything, she was part of a team working in tandem to survive. Eventually, the sky bison left the ground far behind, and the attacks stopped. Ty Lee was free to look down at the world without fear, watching Tian Keng Fortress pass away beneath her. The ugly fortress gave way to rocky landscapes brought to life by luscious green plant life. It all glowed in the sunlight, and she was so transfixed by this unique perspective on the world that she only noticed that the sky bison was moving through clouds when the moist wisps brushed her skin. Ty Lee had often wondered what clouds felt like, thinking them like pillows or feathers, but discovering now that they were actually bright mists willing to welcome her with a refreshing embrace almost made her faint from the shock of happiness. By the time the sky bison landed again, Ty Lee was a sobbing mess. She had gained the sky, but in exchange she had been forced to give up Mai. The sky bison had no sooner been lost to sight in the sky before Zhao was ordering his soldiers away from Tian Keng Fortress and away from this failure. The avatar was gone, alive, but the airbender prisoners had escaped. Zhao needed to report this to Prince Iroh, needed to deflect blame as much as he could, and get new orders. By the time anyone else identified him as being at fault, he would hopefully have more victories to make up for everything that had happened here. After all, he certainly hadn't designed the defenses in the fortress. If 2 weapons of the Fire Nation could survive them, then that was hardly his fault. Who kept losing these weapons, anyway? Well, Prince Oze was a good candidate. It wasn't until they had gotten away from Tian Keng Fortress and landed in a sheltering valley that Katara had been able to ask Aang where her brother was, and his explanation had frozen her blood in her veins. "What do you mean, he was captured?" Aang looked over to the girl in pink, the supposed airbender traitor, who turned out actually wasn't or something, where she was curled up on the ground crying. Some of the nuns were trying to console her, but she wasn't responding to any of them. Aang looked back to Katara. "I'm not sure of the details, but the Tr Ty Lee said he gave himself up to buy her and my time to free the airbenders. She thinks he's their captive somewhere." Katara shook her head. "That didn't make any sense. Then why did we leave?" "Because Dashane gave a slow, heavy shrug. Because we couldn't stay." Katara reached out and shoved him. He looked at her with wide, surprised eyes as he stumbled back, but she pulled her hat low and refused to accept his lies. "Sure, we had to stay and fly into that hole to save your airbenders, but when it's my brother, then it's too dangerous." He blinked and rubbed his eyes. "That's not how it is. You know that." "Do I? I left my behind, too. Do you think I don't care about either one?" He blinked again, and a pair of tears ran down his cheeks. "That'd I'd replace any of you." And with that, the ice on her heart shattered into wet snow. Oh, Aang. She let him draw her into a hug, and kept murmuring, "I'm sorry," until she thought he might believe it. As they waited for Long Feng and his earthbenders to meet them, there hadn't been room on Appa for everyone, and it made sense for earthbenders to be the ones to make their way through the tunnels. They took care of the survivors. Appa was relieved of his saddle and allowed to nap, after all the weighed-down flying he had done. As Momo flew around and hunted bugs, Katara and Aang tried to make the airbender nuns comfortable. Katara healed any injuries they had, and all the camping supplies and blankets were laid out for everyone to rest on. Mother Malu had laughed and greeted each of her sisters one by one. Meanwhile, Katara was the first to approach Ty Lee. The airbender traitor was probably really cute, Katara decided, when her face wasn't smeared with tears and snot and mud, and her hair wasn't a tangled wet mess hanging in a half-escaped ponytail. "Are you okay? Do you have any injuries?" Ty Lee had stopped crying a while ago, but she still blinked at Katara's question as if she only had one ear in reality. "What? Are you hurt? I'm a waterbender healer. I can help you." Ty Lee shook her head and then lowered it into her hands. Katara sat down next to the other girl. "Sister Matagi told us all about what happened in the sinkhole. That you helped everyone, and what good friends you are with Mai." She left out how Matagi had also shared her views of Ty Lee's past. Katara didn't exactly approve of all of Ty Lee's life choices, but neither had she approved of Mai's. What was important to her right now was the decision and ability to change. "We're not clear on some of the details. What really happened after Zhao's troops came for you all?" Ty Lee raised her head just enough to look at Katara with wet eyes. "I tried to stop him. I really did. I told the soldiers who I was and tried to intimidate them. You know, how royalty would do it, or those other girls from the academy. But it didn't work. They didn't hurt me, but they took me and brought me to Zhao. He was worried about politics stuff because of my family and me being a weapon, but he still locked me up. I thought if I hid my airbending, then maybe Princess Azula would get me freed, and I could maybe ask for the nuns to be set free, too, but she lowered her head again, and her next words were muffled. But I'm a stupid airhead who doesn't understand how anything works. I just get my friends hurt and killed. Like the circus. Like Ty Lee's next breath came out like a sob. Katara leaned over, put an arm around the other girl, and said, "Hey, you might not be the brightest, but that's no call for using slurs." Ty Lee looked up again, confusion evident on her face. "Huh. You know, airhead. And you're an airbender. No need to be like that." Ty Lee blinked. Katara smiled. Ty Lee blinked again. "That was terrible. I know. My brother is really the one who makes the jokes. I hope we get him back soon." Finally, Ty Lee smiled back. "I'll help you save him. He's one of the most generous people I've ever met. I don't think he even really liked Mai or me, but he risked himself to save us. And if he's funny, too, then I definitely want him around." Her smile turned a little sharp. Katara put on an expression of mock sternness. "Hey, my brother is off limits to circus acrobats. He deserves a girl with a much more boring job." Ty Lee giggled. Katara angled her head back a little, satisfied. She might not be able to help Sokka right now, but she could at least make people feel a little better. And if that resulted in another weapon of the Fire Nation on their side, and a new team capable of rescuing Sokka and Mai and then saving the world, then that was great, too. Aang quickly gathered everyone once Long Feng and the other earthbenders arrived at their little sanctuary, but the word was not good. "We found no one else in the sinkhole," Long Feng said, sitting down on a stone he had raised from the ground, "so we finished collapsing it and retreated. The fire army was already pulling back when that first wall went down, so they escaped with few casualties beyond what they suffered during our battle. So I consider it likely that your friends are still out there, somewhere, safe but captive." Aang supposed that was good news. "Then how do we find them? Once Appa is rested, we could go back and try to sneak into whatever camps they have set up, and dash." "Avatar," Long Feng interrupted, "you have to understand the reality of how this works. With their fortress gone, the Fire Nation will be angry and cautious. They'll expect you to come back, and they'll already have moved the prisoners to safe locations. Even now, reinforcements are probably on their way, and news of the loss of the fortress is already spreading across the world on the army's telegraph lines. I'm sorry, but there is no easy solution to this. Aang looked to Katara, and then to Ty Lee. He saw similar hurt expressions on both their faces, hurt that echoed the twisting in his own gut. So you're saying we can do nothing? And then Long Feng actually smiled. Now might be a good time to become better acquainted, Avatar. My Earthbenders and I aren't just unusually capable rebels. We were once the elite protectors of Ba Sing Se's culture. When the city fell, we escaped, and we took all of our skills and intelligence with us. Our secondary objective today was to destroy Tian Keng Fortress, but our primary goal was the acquisition of certain intelligence. Finding things out, you might say, is our specialty. We are the Dai Li. Aang felt a slow grin creeping up on his face. So you're saying you can find out what happened to Mai and Sokka? Long Feng nodded. The Fire Nation will be sloppy, after the loss of their fortress. My people will be listening, and hunting down the specific information you want. However, this will take some time. The Dai Li do not rush things, and that is why we have survived and thrived. That's how we maintained order in Ba Sing Se throughout the war. So I want you and your friends to rest, to figure out what you can do while we wait for news. And on that note, I am hoping that you can help me with a little project. That sounded reasonable. Just camping out would get boring fast, and Sokka and Mai would want them to keep trying to make the world a better place, he was sure. What project? Long Feng leaned forward, and spoke in an intense whisper. I'm sure you've felt how wrong the world has gone, since the war ended. Ashlands filled with ghosts, reports of monsters from legend, sickness amongst people forced to leave their ancestral homes. The world is suffering for the Fire Nation's greed. Aang nodded. This was exactly what Roku had told him about, what he had been trying to find ways to fix. Guru Puthak had tried to teach him how, but that had just ended in tragedy. And sure, it was great that there were more airbenders in the world, but Aang wasn't sure how that was supposed to actually fix stuff like evil ghosts. Long Feng said, amongst the culture of Ba Sing Se were writings, the old lore of the avatars and the Earth Kingdom's greatest shamans. The Dai Li rescued those writings from the city's fall, and I think I've found a way to restore things. Restore. To take the haunted ashland that Ba Sing Se has become and save it. To free the ghosts back to the reincarnation cycle, or maybe even restore them to life. After all, the ash is just another form for their lost bodies. Who knows what heights we can achieve with the right materials and the rituals I have found. Aang blinked. Restore ghosts to life? That sounded impossible, sounded bizarre. But Long Feng was saying it was only one possibility, he was just speculating, really. Putting the ghosts in the ashlands to rest sounded more manageable, and exactly what Aang was trying to do. What kind of materials do you need? The reason I came to Tian Keng Fortress was because of that Commander Zhao who has given you repeated trouble. He oversaw the mining of platinum at the South Pole, and even as he's chased you, he's received regular reports about the Fire Nation's platinum assets. One of my agents recovered a report about deliveries to a certain storehouse, and a significant amount of platinum that we can liberate for our own purposes. You see, the metal is dash. I know how special platinum is, Aang interrupted. It does strange things to spirit energy. The Fire Nation is using it to hunt spirit creatures, and my friend Mai used a platinum knife to fight Dash. He couldn't stop a wince from overtaking him as he remembered the airbender undead they had encountered at the Southern Air Temple. She fought unnatural enemies. Long Feng leaned back and nodded. Exactly, Avatar. So will you help me, while I help you find and rescue your friends? Aang looked to Katara. She nodded and said, when we bring Sokka back, I want to show him a better world. I'm in. Aang was going to agree and pledge himself to Long Feng, but then he remembered the other person standing nearby. The airbender from the Fire Nation. The girl he had almost hurt. A stranger who might be a powerful ally, or might be a profound disappointment. He looked over to Ty Lee and said, what about you? Ty Lee startled, as if she had thought no one knew she was there. You want me to help steal this platinum metal? To fix the ashlands. Aang nodded. You see, the Fire Nation dash. I'm in. Aang paused before he could explain anything. You are? Just like that. Ty Lee hugged herself and nodded. I lived with the nuns in an ashland for a while, remember? I want to help you bring peace to those voices. For so long I've just been concerned about bringing balance to myself. I didn't care about anything else. I just ignored the war. But I've always known that the Fire Nation has some things wrong. It's why the other airbenders all hate me. She blinked, and blushed. I think it's why you hate me, Avatar. I don't want to hurt the people of the Fire Nation, but I want to start doing what I can to help the ones they've hurt. Aang was going to say that of course he didn't hate anyone, but opened his mouth to speak and then stopped. He had kind of hated Ty Lee when he saw her in the sinkhole. And that hate had nearly made him hurt this confused girl who now wanted to help him. Okay, he said at last. I think that will be good for all of us. Long Feng eyed Ty Lee for a moment, and then shrugged. I thank you all for your help. Now, it's time for us to rest, and then we'll have to see about relocating. I have a base that we can use as shelter. It has room enough for the nuns, and it's close enough to our platinum target. That sounded good to Aang. It just showed how the world worked. They had lost Mai and Sokka in that sinkhole, had suffered and nearly died, but they had emerged with both the beginnings of a revived Air Nation and capable new friends who could help Aang in his quest. The world never took without giving, never gave without taking. And the air nomads had taught how to both receive and let go. But that didn't mean he couldn't find his friends again someday. The world could count on that. Sokka was becoming an expert on waking up in dark caves after a beating, and he was not happy about it. Nor was he happy about the chains around his wrists and ankles, or the fact that when he followed those chains with his hands, he found them sunk deep into stone floor as though they had been dunked into liquid, and then the liquid hardened into stone. Nor did he have any affection for the fact that when he called out, "Hello," his voice echoed in a way that told him the walls and ceiling formed little more than a closet around him. He was almost happy when a light appeared in front of him, revealing a small barred window in the door of what was apparently his prison cell. But then a man's face appeared in that light on the other side of the bars, the face of the man who had knocked Sokka out in Zhao's office rather than providing a normal rescue like normal people did. The man wore a cone hat with a gold spike at the top, and the man's hands were encased in what looked like segmented stone gloves. "Hello," the man said. "You just make yourself comfortable. You have a long stay ahead of you, and a busy schedule. You and the Fire Nation trash have lots to learn before the two of you can go back to the Avatar." Sokka was definitely not happy to hear that. Not one slushing bit. Chapter 35, Platinum Raiders. It had been a week since Katara had lost her brother in the sinkhole, and the pain was still sharp in her heart. She stood now beside a babbling river in a densely canopied forest, seeking solace in the water-bending arts but finding nothing. The movements, the philosophy, the stances, all of it was knowledge given to her by Master Hama in the scorching bowels of Crescent Island, whispered from cage to cage and demonstrated when they weren't watched. Katara had trained in waterbending for years without ever manipulating so much as a drop of liquid, until the day when she at last escaped her imprisonment. Until the day when Sokka came to rescue her, bringing her a gift of full water skins and freedom. Becoming one with the water of this river now, moving it and fighting with it, just reminded Katara of her missing brother all the more. It didn't help that there was little to distract her, here in this forest. Long Feng had stressed the dangers of this mission, of the desperate need for diligence and timing, but his briefing had utterly failed to prepare her for all the waiting that seemed to be necessary before the Dai Li went into action. She had been forced to find her own distractions, but it never pushed away the aching emptiness for long. Sighing, Katara turned back to her sparring partner. "So how many are there?" Ty Lee shrugged. "Too many to count. Here, I'll show you." The two girls had been filling the time by becoming familiar with each other's fighting styles. They might be fighting as allies soon, and needed to be prepared. Just past this obscuring forest, past Katara's vision where the river met the ocean, a Fire Nation settlement belched smoke and radiated heat. According to Long Feng, it was to that settlement that the Fire Nation was shipping its raw ore from the South Pole and other nearby mines to be melted and cast into ingots. Thankfully, Long Feng's plan didn't require Katara or her friends to infiltrate the settlement or even the forge. She'd had more than enough of Fire Nation installations for a long time, after Tian Kang Fortress. She had lost more than enough to Fire Nation fortresses already. But until word came that it was time to put Long Feng's plan into action, there was nothing for Katara to do but wait, practice her waterbending, be reminded of the brother she had failed, and learn something about the newest weapon of the Fire Nation to join the Avatar's quest. Ty Lee stepped over to Katara and grabbed her left arm, and then began tapping spots all up and down the limb. Here, 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 and here. She leaned over and moved down to Katara's leg. Here and here, too. This one is a really good one. And then there's this one, this one, this one, and this one on this side. She stood up again, moved so that she was standing behind Katara, and began tapping up and down her back. There's lots more spots starting here, 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 here dash. Okay, I get the idea, Katara said, hopping away. With each spot Ty Lee had pointed out, she had tapped Katara's skin to illustrate it, and just that much contact had sent shivers racing up through Katara's bones. She couldn't help shuddering, imagining how it would feel to be punched on one of those spots with the kind of strength in Ty Lee's deceptively lean arms. I never realized there were so many chi meridians in a body. Can my waterbending heal the blockage? Ty Lee's eyebrows furrowed. I'm not sure. Your healing works by using a person's chi to promote the healing, right? More or less. Then probably not. Ty Lee gave a shrug. The chi itself would be disturbed after I hit a meridian, so I don't think your healing could even make use of it until it's restored. Katara bit her lip. This dim mak was a seriously powerful fighting style. It was a good thing it was such a hard skill to learn, or else the Fire Nation wouldn't have needed 100 years and a comet to conquer the world. How did you learn to fight like this, anyway? She moved to the edge of the river and took a waterbending stance, summoning a small stream to fly up and hover over her outstretched arms, just like she had tried when Sokka first gave her the waterskins. Ty Lee took her own fighting stance, but didn't close the distance. She was giving Katara a chance to attack first. Well, there's this hidden temple in the poison jungles on Suhao Island that can only be found by the pure-hearted. Sure, Katara grunted as she shifted her body and flung her right arm into a slash. The water hovering above the limb snapped forward like the tongue of a turtle frog, whipping at Ty Lee's feet. But the acrobat was already dodging with a series of butterfly kicks, chattering the whole time. A mute master lives in the temple who will give visitors a quest to prove their strength. Makes sense. Katara rolled forward and crossed her outstretched arms, creating a pincer attack with both ends of her water supply. Once you satisfy the quest, Ty Lee said as she crouched under the reaching tentacles and then sprang up in a forward-flipping jump, the Masters teaches by movement alone, since he can't talk. Katara found Ty Lee landing right in front of her, and tried to summon her water back to form some kind of defense, but it was no use. Katara's belly got an idle poke, no chi-blocking punch, but just a normal poke like one would use in a tickle attack that sent her tripping backwards to fall into the river. When Katara resurfaced, Ty Lee was stretching on the riverbank and immediately returned to her explanation with, "It took me about a whole summer to learn the basics from the master, but he gave me some scrolls to take home with forms to practice. Of course, the writing on the scrolls is only visible after meditating on the swirl of the cosmos for about an hour. Of course." Katara spat out some water and climbed back up to dry land. "So how many people have managed to do all that?" Ty Lee paused in her stretching, and her face pinched into a frown. "Just me and one other person that I know of, another weapon of the Fire Nation. But not everyone would go out of their way to tell people about those kinds of skills, you know." Katara was going to ask about this other weapon of the Fire Nation, but she was distracted by Aang's sudden arrival. He burst from the thick foliage of the forest to skid to a stop just at the edge of the river. His gaze was drawn to Ty Lee first, and the excitement on his face faded for a moment. Katara had been training with Ty Lee all week, but Aang had yet to so much as spar with her. And he certainly hadn't trained her to make better use of her airbending. But Katara knew all too well the kind of pain Aang had to be feeling around Ty Lee, who was supposed to be Mai's most beloved friend. It wouldn't be all that different from what she felt about Sokka every time she used her waterbending. Aang quickly recovered once he turned his gaze to Katara, and the excited light returned to his eyes. "Time to get dressed," he said. "Agent Zhuang says the ship is here." Katara grinned as she used a quick bit of waterbending to remove all the dripping water from her skin and wrappings and fling it back into the river. It was time to strike back at the Fire Nation after they took her brother and Mai from her. They would learn the vengeance of the Water Tribe. Mai knew what was being done to her. Keeping her in darkness, denying her all contact with other people, not giving her enough food and water to satisfy her hunger, waking her up with loud noises whenever she fell asleep, even keeping her in an underground cell with no access to any timekeeping devices or methods. It was all straight out the handbook for preparing a prisoner for interrogation. Angela had discussed such tactics, and Mai had remembered them in case she ever wound up on the receiving end. The Fire Nation wasn't the only group out there in the business of breaking people. Unfortunately, it turned out that knowing what was happening didn't stop it from happening, and didn't stop it from driving her crazy. That thought made Mai laugh, maybe a little too loudly, her body shaking enough to rattle the chains that connected her wrists to the floor. Now she knew how Mother Malu felt. Maybe Katara could restore Mai's sanity, too, with a little helpful waterbending. If she ever saw Katara again. If she ever saw Ty Lee, or Aang, or even Sokka again. Not for the first time, she found herself suddenly breaking out into sobs. This rattled the chains, too. When the door opened with a loud scraping sound, Mai was so startled that she screamed. Her heart hammered in her chest so powerfully that she was afraid it was going to burst, and she was left gasping on the floor of her cell as dull, eye-searing green light shone in through the opening, and a man in a spiked cone hat and black robes walked in. "Who?" Mai panted for more breath before she could continue her question. "Who are you?" The man said nothing. None of them ever did. He simply leaned over, grabbed Mai's chains where they were sunk into the floor, and lifted them out as if the stone ground itself had suddenly liquefied. Her chains turned out to be a single set of links joining her wrists together, the center having been buried in the floor by an earthbender. The man then turned and walked straight out of the cell, never having said a word. The door remained open behind him. Another tactic: the man wanted Mai to follow him of her own free will, to choose to play his game and submit to his authority. And she knew it was only the illusion of choice, that to remain sitting in her cell until she died wasn't really an option, and the door would remain open for as long as it took her to run out of patience. Just because she knew what was being done to her didn't mean she could do anything about it. Mai rose with the clanking of her chains and walked out of her cell. The man was waiting just outside. The corridor around him was made of the same dark stone as the cell, but out here there were green crystal torches lining the walls at intervals, leading off into the distance. Without a word, the man began walking down the corridor, not even looking back at Mai. She followed, knowing she had no choice. The man took a deliberate path through the underground complex, turning with confidence down certain hallways. Mai found all the other paths blocked by other men in the stupid hats and robes, all standing silently and denying her ability to do anything but follow their compatriot. Eventually, her guide came to a stop in a room that seemed to be nothing more than a larger copy of her empty cell in construction. A stone chair rose up out of the ground in the back, and some kind of circular metal rigging stood waist-high in the center. No doubt her hosts wanted Mai to sit in the chair and watch a show. Instead she spun and whipped her chains to her guide's face. But he was ready for that, no expression on his face as he caught the chains with a single hand covered in segmented black stone, and then the ground itself was moving beneath Mai's feet to spin her around, the speed of it whipping her own chains to wrap around her. She continued to struggle, but in short order was made to sit in the chair. The man used his earthbending to turn the segments of his gloves into binding for Mai's arms and head, and then he took a position at the center of the metal rigging. Another goofball in the robes and hat brought a lantern with old-fashioned, warm candle light inside of it. The lantern fit neatly into the metal track, and then her guide set it into motion with a wave of his hands. The light moved around him as his friend left, the motion steady and boring. It went on like that for a while, and Mai grew sleepy. She knew she needed to stay awake, that this was probably part of some kind of crazy Earth Kingdom interrogation, and her mental health was in great danger in this room, perhaps more than even in her cell. "You ash lickers," she growled as loudly as she could to chase away the eerie silence, "are all going to die. Someone is going to come for me, and then I'm going to cut my way through every single one of you and mix your blood together." Her guide didn't react, and the circling lantern didn't stop. Maybe he knew she was lying. By the time he began asking questions, she was beyond the ability to hear them clearly, but she nevertheless found herself giving detailed answers. Aang felt a little weird, working with a complete plan and even some contingency scenarios. But the fact that he had just lost 2 friends showed the need for that level of preparation. Sokka and Mai had been captured by the Fire Nation while he had been stuck underground as the result of a poorly thought-out plan. They were the first 2 people he had met in this strange new world, 2 people who he cared about. Sokka had been Aang's dedicated friend since they left the South Pole, always loyal and always looking out for everyone. And Mai. Aang just knew that it hurt to think about her being in the clutches of the nation she betrayed for him. Long Feng had said that Mai was too valuable to the royal family to kill, but how could he really know for sure? How could he even be certain that Mai hadn't decided to go down fighting? But those were questions Aang didn't want answered, so he focused on the here and now, on the wind battering at his face, on the reins in his hands and the sky bison beneath him. He glanced back at Appa's saddle, confirming that the Dai Li agents were all settled. Katara hung over the saddle's side, ready to drop down when they were in position, holding her hat down over her eyes. And beside Aang on Appa's head, Ty Lee sat waiting. He looked over at her, and her own goldish-gray eyes shifted to meet his gaze. There was caution in her gaze, but whether it was for the mission they were about to embark on for Long Feng or something to do with Aang himself was a mystery he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. She was Mai's friend, according to what Aang had been told, and wanted to help his cause now that she was a fellow airbender. She had been on the receiving end of the Fire Nation's awfulness and, like Mai, wanted to combat its worst elements. But Aang still couldn't be comfortable around her. He had fought her, thinking her an enemy, and found a foe he couldn't beat. If even Mai could betray him, what could this girl do? Had his initial bad assumptions about her planted the seeds for future betrayal? And what did it mean that one of the Fire Nation's greatest warriors had been given the gift of airbending? What did it even mean that airbending had returned to the world? Most importantly, what was Aang supposed to do about it? But he kept those questions in the same place where he kept his worries about Mai, and tried to smile at Ty Lee. "Are you ready?" She nodded, and leaned down to rub the fur on Appa's head. "This is going to be a dream come true, up until we get to the part where I have to fight my countrymen. That part isn't going to be as much fun." Aang decided to accept that at face value and looked to the waters below. Appa was flying out over the bay, leaving behind both the forest where they had been hiding for the last week and the settlement they had been hiding from. The bay was a natural formation taken advantage of by the Fire Nation for its defensibility. Large stone cliffs circled the bay, leaving one lone entrance just large enough for a cargo ship to sail through safely. One such cargo ship bobbed just outside the entrance now, waiting for the tugboat that would guide it through the walled passage. The cargo ship's arrival had been what spurred Aang and the Dai Li into action. Their objective, as described by Long Feng, was fairly simple: to steal the whole ship and the platinum in its belly. The execution would be a little more complex. "There they are," he said, spotting the 2 Fire Nation destroyers that guarded this bay from pirates and rebels. Those warships were much faster than any cargo vessel, and so had to be stopped from interfering or giving chase. That part was Aang and Katara's job. He handed the reins to Ty Lee, added a quick, "Good luck," and then jumped straight off of Appa's head. Behind him, Katara did the same. Rather than using his airbending to slow his fall, Aang moved into the same waterbending form that he knew Katara would be using right now. He focused on the bay water below, calling it to him with gathering motions of his arm, and as a wave rose to catch him, he threw his arms out wide. The water, rather than stopping his fall, embraced it, and Aang straightened his entire body to become like an arrow in flight. He sped through the water, angling so that his plunge would turn into a climb, and he popped back out of the bay with enough speed and force to land skidding on the deck of one of the Fire Nation destroyers. Katara, he trusted, was having a similar experience. Aang had worked with her to develop this plan, planning out everything they would have to do and refining it with some practice in a lake before they came to the area to wait. Now, they each just had to take out an entire Fire Nation destroyer. It wasn't even going to be a challenge. Before the sailors and soldiers on the deck even registered who he really was, Aang was launching himself into an airbending assisted run, his right hand stretched out to the edge of the deck as he moved. He couldn't see it, but he could feel the water of the bay responding to that beckoning arm, splashing up to follow even as he plunged into the entrance to tower that held the ship's bridge. People gasped at his movement, and some were quick enough to even try to grab at him, but Aang kept pouring on the speed, knowing exactly where he was going and unafraid get there as fast as possible. The wind of his passage buffeted at everyone who tried to get close, and the spray of water following him cut off any attempt to firebend at his back. He reached the bridge before the crew even had time to sound an alarm, still trailing an arm's length of bay water. The bridge crew turned to him in surprise, but they weren't ready for a fight. Aang transformed the momentum of his run into an offensive assault, using fists and feet and bursts of wind to knock everyone out of the fight they didn't even know was already over. Then he got down to the important part. He pulled the last of water he had brought with him up off the floor, and swung his whole body in a movement like the blow of an axe. The water responded, thinning and taking on his strength, serving as his blade as he hacked apart all of the bridge controls. In just a few minutes, the whole bridge was reduced to a storage room for scrap. By that time, the alarm was not only sounding, but going crazy. Aang could see, through the front viewports, a stream of soldiers towards the tower, and he heard frantic footsteps on the stairs leading up to the bridge. They thought they had him trapped, and that he wouldn't be able to fight alone against the numbers they were bringing to bear against him. They were right about the last part. The first part? Not so much. Aang took a running leap straight through the wide viewport at the front of the bridge, landing in the comforting embrace of the winds to be carried safely on the deck. 2 more hops were all that he needed to jump over the ship's side back to the waters of the bay, but this time he didn't let himself sink into them. After all, he had to get over to the cargo ship that Ty Lee and the Dai Li would be stealing right now, and without his glider, the fastest method of travel available right now was a wind-enhanced run. The water of the bay shot up behind him as he dashed across its surface, and as he moved close to the bay's exit, he saw Katara coming to meet him, speeding away from the other destroyer, which now had some ugly smoke coming from its engine, on a surfboard of ice. Aang hoped the rest of the mission was going this well. Ty Lee got to fly the skin bison. Ty Lee got to fly the sky bison. It was just for a short distance, taking over for Aang after he and Katara jumped off to go sabotage the destroyers, and doing nothing more but keeping Appa steady and then signaling him to land on the cargo ship's main deck. Yet Ty Lee still couldn't hold back a joyful laugh as the wind pulled at her braided hair and rustled her clothes in Appa mood, or whatever, beneath her, and she felt the power of their dive in her stomach. She didn't know what the future held for her right now, but she dearly hoped she'd be able to get her own sky bison. Then she could spend whole days flying around. But for now, the joy faded as she brought Appa down into a war zone. The Dai Li agents leaped from the saddle even before the sky bison's feet had touched the deck, throwing punches that sent fist-like constellations of stone flying out at the sailors who were still gaping at the arrival. Ty Lee could see that these were no warriors, no soldiers, they wore simple red tunics, and the only things hanging from their belts were tools. Their postures were the experienced solidity of sea legs, not the loose stances of trained fighters. The stones of the Dai Li struck them, and then they didn't get up again. Ty Lee could feel her aura becoming streaked with tarnished silver. When Long Feng had first formulated the plan with them, back in the large cave the Dai Li were using as a base in this region, Ty Lee had piped up with, "What's going to happen to the sailors on the cargo ship? Are you going to take them prisoner?" Long Feng had looked at her with an unreadable expression, but she could see that his aura swirl with deep black and painfully bright yellow. In situations demanding speed and exact timing, taking unnecessary prisoners is not a viable option. Which was fancy talk for killing everyone. Ty Lee was about to object when Aang had actually beaten her to it, saying, "You're not going to slaughter those people. They're not warriors, they're people trying to survive and feed their families. Avatar, I do not seek to murder anyone." Ty Lee had watched Long Feng's aura for the muddy pink of dishonesty, but instead it was the deep red of strong will and practicality. "I will have no problems taking prisoners if any of the sailors surrender, nor will we call the wounded. But the fighting forms of the Dai Li are about efficiency and effectiveness, and the results can be fatal. Asking my agents to specifically fight to wound in complicated combat situations will put them in danger and jeopardize the mission. Katara had put a reassuring hand on Aang's shoulder at that point. I understand what you're saying. Water tribe warriors don't hold back, either, but why would the protectors of a city's culture be trained like soldiers? Long Feng had offered a shrug that was the most artificial thing Ty Lee had ever seen. You'd have to ask Avatar Kyoshi. She was the one who established the Dai Li and trained the first generation. Everything we are has been passed down directly from her. Avatar Kyoshi. Aang had pulled away from Katara to turn his back on the gathering, and Ty Lee could see his aura becoming tainted with a muddy gold shade. I thought I was always taught dash. Avatar, Long Feng had interrupted, I'd be happy to give you a history lesson on the Dai Li, but I'm afraid it's not a quick story, and we don't know when exactly the cargo ship will be arriving at its destination. If you're going to take it before it enters the protection of the bay and after it has passed beyond the protection of its military escort, then you'll need to be on station and ready to go as soon as possible. This plan has many factors, and you'll need to practice some of it before you'll be ready. Now, if I may continue. Aang had sighed and faced them all again, but Ty Lee could see that his aura was still troubled. His gaze found Long Feng as he said, I understand that not everyone has the respect for life that I do, and I try to accommodate the differences of other cultures. But I'm going to be watching to make sure your agents keep to your word. As you say, Avatar. Long Feng had bowed low. Discipline is the primary weapon of the Dai Li, and I have every confidence that you will have no cause for disappointment. Except now Ty Lee was standing on the deck of the cargo ship looking at the bodies of some of the sailors while the Dai Li agents moved ahead of her to continue their piracy, and she knew that no one had actually made any out-loud offer of surrender. Long Feng's agents were keeping to his word, all right, but that still didn't seem to be leaving much room for life. Ty Lee wondered if this was what Aang's people had been like. He seemed like a good person, but he couldn't control Long Feng. He wouldn't have been able to control his elders in the Air Nation, either, as they prepared to invade the Fire Nation. Ty Lee took a deep breath and moved into a run. She raced ahead of the Dai Li, dancing right across the vectors through which they were launching the small black panels of stone they were wearing under their robes like armor, and threw herself in amongst the sailors who were trying to mount some kind of defense of their ship. She threw her fists out and found weak, yielding flesh. Each person she struck cried out first in pain and then in panic, horrified when their limbs would not respond to their commands. Then it was a simple matter to shove or trip them to take them out of the fight. She struck hard and didn't hold back. If the Dai Li creeps were going to be all rough and mean about this, then was going to see how many of the enemy she could disable before the Earthbenders had a chance to kill them. After all, Long Feng had promised that no one who was unable to fight would be executed, and Ty Lee's fists were really good at taking the fight out of people. She raced down into the bowels of the cargo ship, ready to personally capture even nook and corridor if she had to. Aang reached the ship just ahead of Katara and summoned a tornado ball to sit on while he waited for her. He watched as she surfed in a circle right in front of the ship's bow, crouching and rising again on her ice board with arms outstretched, and the water at the center of her motion began coiling and pulsing. When she rode out into the center of it, Aang hopped over and grabbed onto her back, giving a quick hi that earned him a blue-eyed smile. Then the water exploded like a spring and shot them both up into the air. They sailed up parallel to the massive cargo ship's hull, and Aang used his airbending to make sure their angle kept them going straight up, rather than smacking into the ship like a bug against a flying bison's teeth. They soared up and over the deck of the ship, and Aang shifted as they reached their apex so that he was now carrying Katara, and it was his wings and legs that took the brunt on the landing. As soon as he set Katara down, Dai Li agent Zhuang marched over. Avatar, we've captured the ship. My people are establishing a skeleton crew right now, and as soon as we've confirmed that no vital equipment has been sabotaged, we can be on our way. Aang reached out a hand, Katara smacked it in triumph. He looked back to Zhuang and said, great. Katara and I took care of the destroyers. They'll have to completely replace the bridge equipment before mine can run again. Katara nodded. I flooded the engines on mine. I think one of the boilers exploded. Zhuang didn't smile, but the tension around his eyes loosened a bit as he nodded. Good work, kids. Now we just have to sail this thing to the rendezvous. The Fire Nation shouldn't have any assets nearby that they can redirect to pursue us before we're gone, but diligence is the key to survival. If you're up to it, I'd like you to take your Sky Bison up and keep a watch for any threats. Aang was going to agree and get going, but then a shout of, "Avatar!" echoed across the deck. Aang turned to see Ty Lee stalking over. The bounce he could usually see in her step was gone, and her face was twisted in a serious expression. He bit back on his nervousness and tried to smile at her. "Yes." Ty Lee threw a look at Agent Chuang, and then she put her arms around Aang's shoulders and guided him away. "I wanted to talk to you about these Daily. They're meanies." Meanies? Even after they helped capture this ship with such finely tuned plan. He wondered if one of the agents had been harassing her about her Fire Nation blood. "Ty Lee, is this something important? We still have some work before we can get away." She started to say, "I dash." "Incoming!" came Katara's shout. In an instant, Aang was beside her at the rail, looking back at the bay. The destroyers he and Katara had sabotaged were still floating there, seemingly helpless, but as he followed her pointing finger, he spotted a line of foam across the water, and spotted a speedboat at its head. It was heading straight for the cargo ship, and was definitely of Fire Nation manufacture. Agent Zhuang came over to take his own look. "Get rid of it. It's an attack of some kind." Katara nodded and extended her arms in front of her, and then swung them up to her right as she shifted from standing straight into a reverse arrow stance. The ocean rose up with something like an explosion at her command right in front of the speedboat, but the craft swerved and avoided the hazard. Katara tried again and again, but failed to stop this strangely small attack. "I can't get it," she gasped, pounding fists lightly against the rail. "It's too fast, and I'm too far away." That's when Aang realized something. It's not slowing down. Even if it cuts its engine, it's not going to be able to stop in time. It must not be coming for us after all. Ty Lee said, "You mean it's just going to go around us?" "No." Agent Zhuang's voice had gone cold. "It's going to ram us." There was a moment of silent horror amongst the group as the craft drew close enough to be lost from their view. Then the speedboat slammed into the cargo ship and exploded. It wasn't a large explosion, but Aang distinctly felt the force of it traveling up through the ship's hull. "Was that enough to sink us?" Agent Zhuang shook his head. "Not immediately, but there's a good chance we're taking on water down there. I'm not sure what level that would be on, but dash." "On it," Katara said, turning and running across the deck. She called back, "I'll keep it iced up," as she plunged down the stairs and was lost to sight. Agent Zhuang followed her. That left Aang alone with Ty Lee. Should he go down and help with the damage, or was this a good time to talk to Ty Lee about whatever it was that was bothering her? The whole matter of the speedboat was still bothering him, but it seemed to be over now. On the other side of the deck, Apple let out a roar. The Sky Bison seemed just as uneasy as Aang, and Momo flapping above his horns in an agitated state. They must not have liked that explosion. That got Aang wondering about the boat. Someone must have been steering it, if it avoided Katara's attacks. Had the pilot been on a suicide mission? Or was this not about punching a hole in the hull after all? Aang stepped back over to the railing and looked over. And jumped back just in time to avoid the plume of blue fire that heralded the flying arrival of a girl in black armor. She flipped in midair and landed on the deck of the ship, and Aang spotted smoke coming from the bottom of her boots. Had she used fire bending to fly, just before she kicked a leg out to shoot more blue fire to arc around Aang and cut him off from the rest of the deck? In the distance, he heard Appa roar in fear. Wait, what had happened to Ty Lee? Aang looked around and found himself alone with the firebender girl. She stared back with shining golden eyes, but she didn't seem to be talking to him when she said, "Come on up, Zuzu. I've found your little friend." Beside the girl, a hand came up to grasp at the rail. A second followed it, and then their owner pulled himself up into view. The scarred face of Prince Zuko of the Fire Nation looked straight at Aang and scowled. Aang took a defensive stance, missing Mai more than ever. There was no transition. One moment Ty Lee was seeing the blue fire flaring through the air in front of Aang, and the next she was below deck, crouched under the staircase leading outside and holding her head in her hands. She was struggling to breathe, trembling all over, and her heart was hammering in her chest so hard that it was almost painful. She wondered if she was dying, if her fear was about to kill her, and the new terror brought on by that thought made her dizzy enough to fall over. Azula was here. Angela was here. Angela was here. Ty Lee loved Angela because they were friends and the princess had offered so many opportunities and she was such a perfect, beautiful person. Ty Lee also feared Angela more than anything else because she would do anything and there was no force on this planet that could stop her from getting what she wanted. And now Ty Lee was an airbender and had sided with Mai and now was helping the Avatar and she hadn't gotten Angela's permission for any of it. Angela was here. Angela was here. Ty Lee curled up on the floor, crippled by fear, of no use whatsoever to her new friends and allies. She had failed them, as she was always destined. Sokka listened with his ear to the cold stone ground, unmoving so as to avoid rattling his chains, eyes closed pointlessly against the darkness of his cell. All of his concentration was on detecting the sounds carried through the stone. He could detect the irregular beat of stumbling footsteps, the whispery sound of a swinging door, and the louder and unmistakable sound of rattling chains. Another prisoner was being brought back from one of the Earthbender's crazy interrogation sessions. Sokka winced in sympathy, remembering or mostly not remembering in a way that made him feel sick his own sessions, of being bound in the chair in the darkness to watch that moving light for hours on end. He had steeled himself to resist like a true Water Tribe warrior, but that hadn't gone well at all. It wasn't until the second session that he discovered his best defense was not resistance, but distraction. Letting his mind wander to thoughts of chemistry and physics and other abstract matters was the best antidote to moving lights and droning voices, but even that only worked for so long. It was with no malice that he assumed Mai would be especially vulnerable to the whole ordeal. She was a person of fierce attacks and defensive walls, exactly what the hypnosis was designed to combat. And he knew Mai was here, somewhere. He had seen the weird earthbenders capture her, using him as bait. He was thoroughly offended by that. He put those thoughts out of his head, though, and focused once again on what he could hear through the ground. As enjoyably guilt-ridden as the sounds of what was probably Mai's return were, that wasn't what he was trying to hear. He was more curious about the VRSSSSSHHHHHH sound he had heard while trying to sleep earlier. It had gone away when the prisoner who was probably Mai was brought back, and now was starting up again. That indicated that whatever was causing the sound was trying to avoid the attention of the guards here, which meant it was either a skittish subterranean animal of some kind of enemy action. Sokka was hoping for enemy action. But he still wasn't prepared when the ground beneath his ear opened up and someone's nose poked up into it. Hissing in surprise, Sokka scrambled back as far as his chains would let him, and then a burst of green glare exploded in his face. His poor, light-deprived eyes took a while to adjust, but he eventually realized he was being spotlit by a shuttered lantern, and the light was being generated by those green crystals the Earth Kingdom liked so much. And the lamp was being held by the first of 3 strangers who were climbing into his cell. Well, this was either very good or a disaster in the making. They had to be earthbenders, given their mode of entry, but not the same kind of earthbenders who had captured Sokka and Mai. These people, 2 men and a woman, wore simple green tunics. Returning the inquisitive glare they were giving him, Sokka noticed that they all had a cloth tied somewhere to their body hanging from a belt, or tied around one arm that bore the circular symbol of the Earth Kingdom, the same one it used for the shape of its coins. Rebels? Sokka decided to cut to the chase and whisper, "Who are you guys?" The one with the lantern, the one who Sokka suspected had given his ear a nose poke, scowled. "The Earth King will be the ones asking the questions, boy." "The who now? Wasn't the Earth King supposed to be dead, burned along with Ba Sing Se on the day of Sozin's comet?" Then one last shape climbed up out of the hole in the center of Sokka's cell. It was a small form, almost childlike, and when it stepped into the light of the lantern, Sokka couldn't immediately tell if it was a boy or a girl. More concentrated examination revealed what he thought was a slightly feminine outline to the body and chin, but the savage grin the newcomer was displaying was a bit distracting. Then he noticed the newcomer's eyes. They were dull and unfocused. This girl was blind. He started to say, "What dash?" The girl immediately cut him off with, "You are in the presence of Earth King Toph Beifong, first of her royal line and incarnate goddess of the earth itself. I order to tell me, right this instant, who the mud you are and what you're doing in Old Man Long Feng's basement. If your explanation satisfies me, I might not leave you here to rot in your own stinking breath." "Oh, really?" Sokka put on his most ingratiating smile. Check the description for the links to the author.